I heard from our mutual friend Ari that someone wanted to come in and talk about Nazis, billionaires, and the Middle East, and I was like, "Say less, let's do it."
So,
All right, so let's start unpacking this a little bit. You wrote a book, I guess, a couple years ago.
yeah,
literally
2.5 years ago.
Literally called Nazi Billionaires.
Yes, that's literally what it's called. Yeah.
And from my understanding, you spent like 4 years deep on this, doing nothing but this research. And I'm going to give the general idea here, but you're going to break it down. Like, you basically traced modern money from major companies, international companies, back to old Third Reich money.
Yeah.
How did you even like get the idea to do this in the first place?
Yeah. I was a reporter at Bloomberg News in New York, and I was hired on this new team which investigated family offices, family-owned businesses, family, non-stock exchange listed companies, which is really a blind spot for Bloomberg because they really focus on companies that are listed or that are publicly traded on the stock exchange. And they soon, and I was hired as a North America reporter, even though I'm Dutch, but soon my American bosses asked me, do you want to, can you cover the German-speaking countries? They assumed me being Dutch that I spoke fluent German, which I certainly did not at that point. Which, of course, as a 25-year-old reporter, I didn't have to heart, or I didn't dare to tell them. I just said yes and amen, and and went for it.
You go to German classes?
I did not. I did not. I did later. No, I did later before I moved to Germany. But what I did was I would spend a month between Thanksgiving and Christmas. I would spend in the Bloomberg bureaus in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And the stories I always came back with were this mix of the financial and the historical and the business side of things. And what really struck me in my reporting was that companies like BMW or Porsche or Audi, mainly car brands, which is really the backbone of the German economy still today, but more importantly, the families that control them today, they would celebrate their fathers and grandfathers for their business successes, but they would leave out any mention of their mass war crimes, of their Nazi affiliations, of their SS memberships, after they had purported to have reckoned with these crimes. So there would be, major global foundations named after them, media prizes, museums, academic chairs, corporate headquarters, you name it, celebrating these men without any transparency from where the money came from. And I thought that was such a whitewash of history, such a brazen distortion of history, that I first ended up reporting about it for Bloomberg and a series of articles. And then actually my colleagues said, you should write a book about this. And actually my old boss, Matt, he came up with the title Nazi Billionaires.
It's a great
already
title.
back in 2017, which really, is very, very to the point, very factual. And I actually ended up leaving Bloomberg in 2017 and moving to Berlin for 4 years and really to immerse myself in the research, in the archival research, interviewing people, trying to talk to these families, but really diving into the history in order to tell the contemporary cover-up story, basically.
Right.
So,
and at this point, you speak pretty good German.
and at that point, so luckily, when I moved to Berlin, which is such a great city, I don't know if either of you have ever been.
I've flown through it. I've never been there.
It's one of my favorite cities on the planet, and luckily for me, I got the group of friends I made that were German, and the Germans, they force you to speak German, so they don't, so I couldn't, initially, I was pretty nervous, so. I kept to English, but I soon felt comfortable enough to speak in German, and that sustained me for 4 years, having to work through. It was tough. It was reporting out a book on such a sensitive and secretive topic, while being a native Dutch speaker, writing a book in English based on German sources was was one of the hardest things I've ever did, and I'm very happy with the result. So
now going back for 1 sec before we go to the investigation, you mentioned how your issue was the whitewashing of like the current generations, leaving out that part about the older generations, which is interesting because it's all like and this is a bit of a hypothetical for
Sure,
you,
sure.
but it's almost like, let's say the current generations
Right.
didn't celebrate the old generations at all.
Yeah.
Just kind of was
Right.
like, they weren't good people.
Yeah.
We're here now doing our thing. Do you think you would feel differently going into the investigation? Because there would be like a sense of recognition there that like, all right, this is not something that was good at all. And
Totally. I mean, either way, you know, I wouldn't have focused on the families I focused on, which ended up coincidentally being what are today Germany's wealthiest and most powerful business dynasties, or some of the world's. You know, had they not so brazenly or cravenly, you know, championed these men for their business successes and leave out any trace of their war crimes.
Right.
You know, if they had not mentioned it, or if they had been, you know, transparent about it in the first place, I would have never had a chance to write about them, you know, but they, you know, acted with such impunity with regards to kind of the lack of moral responsibility towards history that I thought that I really wanted to shine a light on that, you know, as a journalist, you know, as a European, as a citizen of the world, you know, I thought it was just to kind of uncover their hypocrisy and show that to the world. I thought it was pretty important.
how much had you studied? Alessi, are you having an audio issue over there?
Yeah, I keep hearing it in one.
All right, hold on one second, everybody.
Sure.
We'll be right back. All right, sorry about that. We're back. What I was going to ask there before we stopped was, how much had you, you know, been a student of regular World War II
Right.
history and stuff growing up? Was that always like an interest of yours, so you were kind of drawn back to it, or not?
So not as much, actually, I would say, as a particular interest to me. You know, I think my family history, you know, my family has, you know, tens of millions of other European families, right? I mean, they had their own experiences during the war. You know, my grandfather, he was a very avid sailor, and he was 25 years old when he decided to sail to England with his best friend to join the Royal Air Force during World War II. And they were blown back to shore on the second attempt, and they were arrested by German soldiers and sentenced as political prisoners. And he spent 20 months doing slave labor in a German steel factory.
Whoa.
Yeah, and he was a tall Dutch guy, 6'5", you know, and he came out weighing 100 pounds, you know, barely alive.
What's up, guys? If you haven't already, please smash that subscribe button and hit that like button on the video. And if you don't have time to watch this episode right now, I'd really appreciate it if you saved it to your watch later playlist on YouTube. Finally, if you'd like to follow me on Instagram or X, those links are in my description below.
And
Was he in there with like other prisoners of the
Yeah,
state,
yeah,
meaning
he
like
was there.
Jews or anything like that? Or
I mean, that is unclear what their background was. All I know from his stories, and, you know, he didn't, you know, I was lucky enough to get to know him till I was 20, and he was really kind of my hero growing up. He was really this kind of, you know, you know, he was super tall and this kind of, you know, proud Dutch patriot, you know, but he really, for him, it was such a traumatizing experience, right?
I can imagine.
And, you know, especially what he saw as, you know, the Germans coming in and occupying his country. It's just, you know, and he wasn't, you know, he was Christian, you know, it wasn't, you know, he was persecuted not for his religious beliefs, but he was persecuted because he tried to flee the country,
Sure.
to then, you know, hopefully liberate his country, right? And, you know, he went to a sanatorium in Switzerland afterwards, because he had tuberculosis. You know, he was emaciated. You know, he was barely alive, and I think he always made jokes about the Germans, kind of growing up. You know, that was his way to deal with what he'd been through. And he lived in a super small farming village, 300 people in the south of the Netherlands near the beach, where all the Germans would always go. So he would always like make jokes like there's another invasion incoming, and you know, but you know, I think that story, and also the story of my other grandparents. My grandfather hid in Amsterdam, center of Amsterdam, for 3.5 years.
He hid there?
Yeah, he hid there because he was Jewish. So he hid there. And my grandmother, together with my 3-year-old aunt, fled to Switzerland, where she was from, and they were with a traveling companion, a painter, and they were arrested by the Gestapo, by the Nazi secret police, on the French-Swiss border. And the Gestapo officer took pity on my grandmother and my 3-year-old aunt, because she, because my aunt was young, and and said, "Oh, report back tomorrow," with implicit message, flee tonight. And they made it over the border into Switzerland, which is
Gestapo
neutral.
officer did
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. But this companion, our traveling companion, this painter, he reported back the next morning. He was deported and murdered in a death camp. Yeah. So certainly those experiences, right? Both, from both sides of my family, very much informed me about history, and that, I think, also pushed me to, wanting to have transparency, wanting to give transparency to these histories, right? And I thought it was also kind of this, having this, kind of this righteous anger about their cover up, which sustained me doing research for 4 years in German documents. Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah, that's some serious ties. Very different experiences as well on both sides. I
totally,
mean,
absolutely,
you can
absolutely.
in some ways, like, obviously you didn't live it, but you lived through it. You lived through those experiences because those are people that you were close to in your life.
Absolutely, yeah. Like, I was very lucky enough to get to know 3 of the 4 of my grandparents and hear their stories, and that very much just informed me about history. But it was actually my maternal grandfather, the one who was locked up by the Germans, who was certainly in a way more, I would say, traumatized by it, but also in a way that, but not in a way that hindered him in any way in his life. But he was able to channel it through humor, which I think is the kind of the best remedy if you can do that.
Sure.
Yeah.
And he also, as you explained, seemed to compartmentalize it because he didn't necessarily like talking about the experiences, which I can imagine. It's so crazy to me when I sit up sometimes. Like, as I get older, we do get farther away from it, but still, we're recording this at the end of 2024.
Yeah.
It is still just 79 years since, quote unquote, like the end of this war, which that means obviously there's people who were still alive. We actually just recorded with 2 World War II veterans and stuff, which is so cool. But like, it's a whole different world technologically, world order wise, everything. And yet this insanity that today would be viewed as like, what, was happening just then.
Yeah, totally. And I just gave a talk in Morristown, New Jersey, and I met 100-year-old veteran, Sid Levitt, who was
cool.
who was like sharp as a razor, and it's just incredible meeting him. And he was part of the liberation of Europe, and thanking him for his service. And I was so impressed by him. And look at my own family now. We have our first enlisted officer. He's a U.S. Marine, and he just deployed to Okinawa.
Ooh.
And so he's so. As far as I know, it's the first one, particularly in these generations who are serving, who signed up and are serving to protect our country and protect the freedom of the world. So I'm really greatly indebted to that.
I also think sometimes, especially like it gives you perspective. We got to meet some of them. Obviously, you got to meet one as well. But even when you just listen to some of these guys who are still alive talk, it's like we fight over so much bullshit now in society. And I understand, there's things we got to have progress on and move forward and stuff. And there's going to be political fights. That's always existed. But it's like the perspective of those guys and the guys from England, France, and all the allies who saw like, the bottom of the abyss, so to speak, not that long ago. Yeah. It's always important to me to remember that because it's like they get, and your grandparents understood the difference between like that fine line between like literal freedom and you're done. Everyone can just die. Yeah. And sometimes in society, I feel like we lose that perspective because we cry wolf on every issue and we ignore the issues that actually, maybe could devolve to something like that.
Yeah, we take things for granted so much, and we're also in that sense, particularly, I would say, in Western Europe and maybe other parts of the West, we're a bit spoiled in that sense of taking our freedoms.
Agreed.
And our liberty for granted. And that's something, the story of my family is the story of tens of millions of other Europeans, and of millions of Americans who will, help liberate Europe or settled in the U.S. after the war, and it is, these are micro stories of my family, right? But this is a story that that tens of millions of families have all across the world.
Absolutely. Now, when you came into Bloomberg, you were saying that they put you on like the family office track and all that and trying to investigate the money that's not on the public exchanges, which to me is really fascinating. And I want to make sure everyone else out there can appreciate that and follow that. So just so you know a little bit of my background, I came from Wall Street before I did this. So I'm not a family office expert, but it's something I came into contact with sometimes, you know, with some of the money that was sloshing around. And it was always so fascinating to me because it was like this ivory tower kind of system.
Yeah,
you just have like this little family tree, and it's like, oh, they have their own set of people working on something. And of course, it sounds like a Bond movie every time. That's not necessarily the case. But like when you were going to look into this, like how do you investigate or report on family offices?
Yeah. It's back when I started, you know, this was late 2011. November 2011, actually the week of Thanksgiving 2011, so exactly 13 years to the week. And, you know, there was the family office space was pretty nascent at the time. You know, it didn't get the, you know, the scrutiny that it gets today, or it's not as big as an industry as it is, you know, 13 years on, right? But, you know, at the time you would meet with, you know, it's what journalists do. You say, hey, you know, I'm new to this beat. Can I meet so and so? You know, and I think especially when you work for Bloomberg, you know, you get a foot in the door. People want to talk to you either on the record, on background, off the record. You know, you get an insight into an industry which is indeed very closed off and secretive. But now the family offices have grown so big, right? Look at, you know, Elon Musk or any of or Zuckerberg or any of these guys or you know, families. You know, they team up with a lot of private equity firms to do big deals, right? So it's become more and more public as a force of nature, and also in deal making, in like a lot big deal making, big mergers and acquisitions or takeovers, rather than just, you know, building the money, you know, building out or sustaining, you know, multi-generational wealth. Through investing in stocks or bonds and real estate and private equity and hedge funds and you name it, right? Or art.
Yeah. Oh, art's a huge one.
Yeah,
too.
huge class.
I still don't understand all that because it's like you have it just so you can hide it for taxes and you don't enjoy it, but it's somewhere in a warehouse and that's on your balance sheet.
Yeah, which is like sad, right? I mean, you should if you buy beautiful art, you should hang it up on the wall. Right?
Yeah, Steve Cohen hangs it on his wall.
Exactly. He does. Yeah.
So
and in his office.
Yes. Yes, I've heard that. But like, you know, the other thing that happens a lot in society now, obviously across the Western world, and I think probably even in the Eastern world, but I know less about that. But, you know, there's this whole kind of like elites versus everyone else battle that goes on, and naturally things like this are in the middle of that, understandably so. But like sometimes I try to talk with people who just throw around the keywords. I'll give you an example. Like they'll just say like, oh, BlackRock's taking over the world or something. And my thought more is like, I've seen these companies up close. They're enormous corporations. They're people who have emails that be like, you know, I have a hard stop at 5 and stuff like that.
It's bureaucrats.
And, and what I try to talk with people about is if you want to talk about where there could be pieces of more sinister, you know, money running the world or things like that, I always say like, look at some of the very, very high-end private equity firms and like some of the family offices they work with, and it sounds like that's pretty much what you were doing.
Totally, because actually the way into the story was that I found to my first story was that I found this kind of opaque looking website of a German family office, which is called the Harold Quant family office.
Yes.
And they had 18 billion in assets under management, and it turns out that Harold Quant.
Is that BMW?
So it is BMW. It's two branches of the Quants.
Okay.
They're the main family in my book. One branch controls the BMW group, which is not only BMW, but it's also a Mini and Rolls Royce. Oh. And it's two siblings. they're the Germany's or Europe's wealthiest siblings. They have an estimated net worth each of 30, 35, 40 billion, 40 billion, liquid, depending on the market. And, and they get each €1 billion dividend every year from BMW, right?
A billion euro dividend.
Yeah.
That'll do.
Yeah, that'll do. That will do. That will do, sir. And there's the other branch, which is the Harold Quant branch, where Harold Quant's mother was the late Magda Goebbels, so the propaganda lady of the wife of Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of the Third Reich.
Didn't they kill?
Yes, so absolutely.
And the kids.
So absolutely. Joseph and Magda Goebbels killed their 6 children in the Führer bunker on April 30th, 1945, right? But Magda Goebbels had a child from her first marriage to Günther Quant, which was one of the biggest industrialists in Germany. And he survived. Harold Quant survived. He survived as a prisoner of war. He was a paratrooper, and he survived. He was in a British prisoner of war camp in Benghazi, of all places. Yes. Yeah. And he survived, and he and his older half brother, the one who ended up rescuing BMW from bankruptcy and made his family the richest in Germany, they became 2 of Germany's largest post-war industrialists.
And they were Nazis.
And Harold actually wasn't. This is the crazy thing. So Harold grew up in the most fanatic Nazi family, right? I mean, your stepfather is a Nazi minister of propaganda. Your real mother is referred to as the the unofficial first lady of the Third Reich. Hitler is in love with her, but says, I need to be celibate because I'm married to the German people, right? So has this arrangement where Magda and Joseph Goebbels serve as this kind of perfect example of unity to the Germans.
They definitely had a lot of threesomes.
They had a lot of affairs, the 2 of them. They cheated on each other so much, right? But they had these 6 children, and then there was the older. Then there was Harold from her first marriage, who was also this blonde kid who fitted these bizarre Aryan ideals, right? So, but he was just, to put it bluntly, he was kind of a spoiled rich kid who wasn't interested at all in Nazi ideology, and he could get away with not joining the Nazi party because his stepfather was Joseph Goebbels. So he actually ends up becoming a paratrooper during World War II, and does all these kind of daring behind enemy line drops on the Eastern Front in Italy, you name it.
But he's not a Nazi.
And he's not a Nazi. His half brother, because that's the way I got into the book. His half brother Herbert was a huge Nazi who built, concentration camps in German occupied Poland, who exploited thousands of men and women in a battery factory in Berlin, including female concentration camp captives, from Auschwitz, who acquired companies stolen from Jews in France. Today, BMW has a foundation named after him with the motto, Inspire Responsible Leadership. Herbert Quant, BMW Foundation, Inspire Responsible. That is the BMW's largest foundation. Like, that is their consumer-facing foundation.
I fucking love BMWs, though. That's the problem.
Okay, well, you won't
They
after
drive
you
great.
won't after this. You won't after this. Believe me. So that was really, that's why the Quants also became the vocal point of the book, because they are still Germany's most powerful, biggest political donors, it's arguably one of its most prominent car brands globally, right? But they have these 2 branches with these 2 different stories, right? Which make it so interesting.
I'm just curious politically, because the Nazis were fascist right wing. Yeah. Did they donate to right or left wing or everything?
No, they donate now. These families now, or at least the BMW Quants, as I call them, the one with the Nazi father and grandfather, they donate to the Christian Conservative Party. So it's the Conservative Party, which is like Angela Merkel's party.
Okay.
It was like the establishment. It's like the business establishment party.
Okay, got it.
There's no continuity, as far as we know, with regards to them supporting the far right or the far left
Above
or
board.
whatever. Well, you know, they want to be. They want to see. They want to show themselves as being, you know, decent people, quote unquote.
Yeah, I got you.
So, so that's what was really. So that discovery of that family office.
That was a
in Germany-
website, you said?
It was a website. It's still up. It's like a one-page website.
Can we pull it up?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, for sure. It's like a Harold Quant family office. HARALD,
Just type into Google. Yeah.
and then space QUANDT. Yeah,
And then family office. Let's see if we can look at this bad boy. Here, where we protect all our money. And absolutely all of it is 100% legitimate. All right, yeah, that first one. Does that look like
I think that might
the
be
first
the
one?
I think that might be
No,
the one.
go back to all.
Yeah.
Go back to all.
Yeah.
Yep. See the
Yeah.
first one?
Yeah.
Hit that. Perfect.
Yeah, that's it. That's the
Okay.
one.
Yeah, we have this on.
That's-
We have it on the screen.
That's the one.
Harold Quant family office manages the pooled assets of the heirs of Harold Quant, who passed away in 1967. Furthermore, the Harold Quant family holds sole shareholdings and respectively one majority shareholding in several financial service companies: HQ Capital, HQ Equita, HQ Trust, HQ Asset Servicing. These financial services companies have a total of approximately US $17 billion assets under management. It's a couple bucks. The core competencies are in the development of global portfolio strategies backed by solid experience in alternative investment classes. There's a bunch of mumbo jumbo to say we're really rich. And
Yeah,
this is a lot of
basically.
money.
Yeah, exactly. And we have dozens of people working for us, investigate, including a huge office in New York.
Now, what about, so you just came across this.
I came across this, and then I looked into because one of my mandates was to look into hidden wealth. And
Bloomberg.
Bloomberg, yeah. So it was family offices, family-owned businesses, non-stock exchange listed, and hidden wealth.
What do they
basically.
mean by hidden wealth?
Hidden wealth is like offshore wealth, like family offices, right? Things that are not, again, the non-listed family-owned companies, the family offices.
Or
Kind of
just
wealth
throw-
that is not, you know, not like the Facebook guys who have an IPO and you know their shareholding, right? But it's basically what their investment vehicles do.
So-
It's kind of what goes on slightly behind, what is not known, what you have to dig into, you know, to tell the audience, basically. Not
So
what's in an SEC filing.
So, like,
Yeah.
fly a drone over Switzerland, basically.
Yeah, something like that.
Gotcha.
You know, yeah. Or send me,
Yeah.
you know, your human drone. Yeah, a human drone.
Yeah, how do you go, like, you know, you're a journalist, a talented journalist, you got the Bloomberg backing, that's great, but how do you even get into places to try to find this stuff?
So Germans are obsessed with the US. So which is kind of strange because, well, I would say, you know, most of Western Europeans are, but kind of strange in the sense that, you know,
We took them
you've also been occupied by for 5 years. But so when I said, hey, I'm a reporter from New York, I work for Bloomberg, you know, like a lot of doors that I think for a lot of German or other European reporters stay closed, opened. That was really the experience because they would love to talk to Bloomberg and they wanted to get exposure, you know, because there's a lot of money here. Maybe they could get some investors because they work with a lot of institutional investors, right? So they get some of that American money sloshing around. Right, so it opened a lot of doors. Actually, that's really what I noticed. If you say, "Hey, I work for Bloomberg. I'm based in New York. You know, I'm coming to Germany," because they're also like, because they, you know, the Germans have this perverse mix of superiority and self-hatred, and so they have this kind of inferiority complex. So when somebody from when an American reporter goes up and be like, "Hey, I want to talk to you guys," they're like, "Yeah, sure. When do you want to meet?"
So even if it's like a portfolio manager of a major family office,
well, yeah, it's a
hiding
CEO,
money?
CEO of a family office, because they're thinking, oh, it's Bloomberg, you know, they're focusing on investments, they're not going to rake up our entire Nazi history, you know.
I mean, that seems a little short-sighted.
Well, yeah, but I think there is a certain confidence in Germany where they think, oh, they're not. This is all bad. I think for a lot of these families, I think this is ancient history. This is like, you know, I think there is also this cognitive dissonance on their side where they think, oh, hey, this is something we dealt with, right? This is, you know.
They donate to the Holocaust Museum, call it a day.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, Yeah, it's also this implicit whitewashing, right? And then
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean the destruction again, like we said earlier, not that long ago. But I guess you, especially when you're born into money.
Right.
Look, I don't have experience with that. I wasn't born into a
Yeah,
family
right.
office family, but from the outside,
Sure.
seeing other people, there seems to be a cognitive dissonance of you
Totally.
thinking that you earned it. Now,
Yeah.
does that not mean
Totally.
that some of these people who inherit it end up being very well educated and like actually are smart and provide value to the economy? Yeah, some of them do, but they have this thing where they ignore whatever went into that, and in this case, it's like in the most sinister way because we're talking about literal financing of like World War II crimes.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I understand that though, right? Because, well, first of all, as I've also noticed with working on these people, or reporting on these people, is that the more money there is, the farther one is away from reality, right? Because you're surrounded by yes men and women, and you don't often have people who say no to you or who criticize your decisions, right? So that's already a problem. Now, second of all, of course, they didn't make that money. So their entire identity is kind of shaped as heirs, right? So they stand in the shadows of their fathers and grandfathers. So to kind of go out and publicly disavow them, that would also mean, what is left of your own identity if you're coming out and criticizing the person who, your entire identity is built around on, right? So they find that exceptionally difficult. Thirdly, particularly, but the families I write about who have these huge consumer-facing companies like BMW and Porsche and Audi and Lamborghini and Seat and Skoda and Rolls-Royce and Mini and you name it.
Wait, Lamborghini's tied up?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
They're Italian.
Yeah, I know, but they were bought by the Volkswagen Group. Yeah. I'm sorry. I hate to break the news to you.
All right, continue.
They're so worried about, they have to protect the brands at all costs, right? And to anything, to hurt the share price or the sales or the standing of the brand, they don't, coming out and saying, hey, yeah, okay, the man who made the brand big was actually an SS officer who was trained at Dachau concentration camp. You can't really, or build concentration camps himself, or like is responsible for the mass murder of tens of thousands, or the mass exploitation of tens of thousands. I mean, that's that you don't want to have that as part of, or they don't want to have that as part of their corporate history, but it is a fact of life. So I always, I think they should argue for I think they should implement radical transparency is what I'd be arguing for.
I wonder if part of the psychology, because like, when they're alone in a room, I'm sure, these people know their family history.
Yeah.
And I'll also give the benefit of the doubt to a percentage of them.
Totally.
At least they probably totally disagree with it. They probably think this was horrible.
For sure.
So let's give at least some of them that credit.
Yeah.
But like
most of them, I would say, even.
You ever seen Godfather 2?
I have, yeah.
Okay. So there's a scene early on in that movie where Michael Corleone's in his office and he's talking with that senator from Nevada.
Yeah.
And the senator's like, I don't like your kind. You come out here with your silky suits and olive oil hair. And you know what? This is the last time we're going to deal together. Don't ever call me again. I expect my payment. Yada, yada, yada. And Michael Corleone's sitting there listening, not saying a word, smoking a cigarette. The guy finishes and he goes, Senator, we're both a part of the same hypocrisy. And there's a part of me that when I hear a story like this also has to recognize that, like, okay, these companies that, removing what they did may have made great products and lived on and still make great products today, but have a sinister past. They could sit there and say, well, what about the fact that like America did Operation Paperclip and took all these Nazis in that got you to the fucking moon and, and improved all your science and things like that because they were scientifically talented in that way.
Yeah.
Right? It's like no matter where you turn, you have some sort of very dark past related to 45.
Listen, I mean, I completely agree with you on that, right? I mean, it's not to engage in like whataboutism, but if you look at my own native Netherlands, right, we never like dealt with our like horrific past of colonialism, slavery, and collaboration with the Germans too, right?
What was the collaboration with the Germans? What's the history there?
I would say relative to population, the most people and the most Jews in Western Europe were deported from the Netherlands. And it's only third behind Hungary and Poland. or Poland and Hungary overall relative to the population, how many people were deported and murdered, right?
Was that by force, or
well,
you're
it was
saying
just-
like they collaborated?
Yeah,
like
they
literal
collaborated. They ratted a lot of
Netherlands?
people out, right?
Mm.
They kept lists. We were more German than the Germans, even though we fashioned ourselves always like, oh, everybody was in the resistance, and that's not something that they didn't try. The Netherlands is still very reluctant to own up to its own past on many levels. I just ended up focusing on the Germans because I'm intrigued. Because it's the third. It's one of the largest economies in the world, right? The third behind the U.S. and Japan. Actually, China's still smaller per GDP, per capita,
per capita GDP.
GDP,
Okay,
exactly, yeah. And and it's not doing so great right now, or it is still relative the economic powerhouse of Europe. It sustains Europe, and politically too, in a way, right? Even though it's a mess politically. So I just focus on the Germans. I do think people are also more interested in reading about the Germans than they are about, I would say, the Dutch. So and these brands, they're global, right? And it's also creating a sense of awareness generally, not only with regard to German products. The money you spend on something, could end up as dividends to these families and go towards the sustaining of a major global foundation named after a Nazi war criminal, right? It is creating a certain sense of awareness, but I would never argue for any kind of, I think people should really choose and do whatever they want. I mean, it's not a call to boycott or something like that. It's a call for transparency.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of a minimum one can ask for.
How much did you, like in your research, study the denazification period from say 45 to 60?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, it was a major part of it. Because the families that I ended up choosing, are what are today still Germany's wealthiest dynasties, and I ended up picking 5, and kind of the contemporary criteria were that they had to have global consumer-facing companies and or massive family offices that invested billions globally. So not families like Krupp, like the Steel dynasty, or Thyssen, like the Steel dynasty, which have died out as dynasties. They need to still be, or they are no longer relevant on a global business stage. Yeah. Secondly, that these dynasties lived on, right? That there's another generation which can kind of reckon, or that can come clean about the past. And thirdly, that I focus on those with small shareholder groups. So like with the BMW, with the Quant BMW Quants, it's like 2, right? Or with the Porsche Pierre dynasty, it's like 12. So they have effective economic control over the policy, over company policy, so they can steer direction. For example, you have companies like Siemens or Henkel, which have 200, 300, 400, 500, 600 family shareholders. So
Wait,
diffuse.
it's that high?
Yeah. So they don't really have a say in their company anymore, right? I mean, they can't really steer their companies anymore. So those are the contemporary criteria, which led me to these 5, 6 dynasties in the book. But the historical criteria was A, that they profited from mass armaments production. B, that they profited from the expropriation of business families, whether they were Jewish or otherwise Gentile, in either in Germany or in German occupied territories, and of course, thirdly, the mass exploitation of forced and slave labor. An estimated 12 to 20 million Europeans were forced into forced and slave labor, including concentration camp captives, but also millions from Eastern Europe and you name it. And, most importantly, that they got off, by and large, scot-free after the war, these men. And they were all men. And
they were all men.
And they were all men. Yeah, yeah. The industrialists were, the patriarchs were.
Because Germany had it was a very man society back then around the world, but Germany had some prominent women and other stuff too. Like
Yeah.
they were a little progressive on that.
Right, exactly. Magda Goebbels and Leni Riefenstahl, it's like, yeah. So, so when it comes to denazification, right? I mean, there were these three. So you have the Nuremberg trials, which ended up being for many, the Cold War starts and the Truman administration decides. So the Cold War starts in early 1947 and the Truman administration decides, the Nazis in Nazi Germany, they're all ancient history. We need to rebuild West Germany as a viable economy and as a bulwark against encroaching communism and the Soviet Union and the Soviet occupied Eastern Germany. So we need to make Western Germany into a viable economy and into like a liberal democracy, whatever, you name it. So the gaze turns from, punishing Nazis into how are we going to rebuild West Germany. So the scope of the Nuremberg trials, the subsequent Nuremberg trials became really limited because the Americans didn't want to put capitalism on trial because it became a war of ideologies.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because the Soviet Union, which had been part of the first Nuremberg trial, they were now in a battle of ideology.
So
right?
you're saying if I'm understanding correctly, you're essentially saying that means the Nuremberg trials focus literally on the members of the Nazi Party, but not the enabler or those that they enabled around them.
They did, but they were very limited. There ended up being three
yeah.
industrialist trials at Nuremberg against one of my main characters, Friedrich Flick,
yeah.
which later became the controlling shareholder of Daimler-Benz.
Julius Streicher too, right?
Streicher was in the first Nuremberg trial with all the military and political heads.
Okay.
But just business wise, it was against Friedrich Flick and his managers. Flick ran the largest steel, coal, and weapons conglomerate during the Third Reich. Was Germany's richest man in 1933, 45, and again 1960 after having been sentenced to war crimes and crimes against humanity, because the sentence was commuted by John J. McCloy, the American High Commissioner for Occupied Germany.
Why?
Because they needed they needed West Germany as an ally in the battle against communism, and also the Korean War. So it was a decision of political expediency that McCloy let off or commuted the sentences of all the industrialists that were sentenced at Nuremberg, but even more importantly, of many high-ranking SS officers who had murdered hundreds of thousands, who had been sentenced to death at Nuremberg. Their death sentences were commuted to life sentences, and then by the mid 1950s, they were released back on the streets of Germany.
Why were they commuted to life sentences first?
Because McCloy needed to appease West Germany for a variety of reasons. First of all, with the start of the Korean War, first Truman and then Eisenhower enacted the War Defense Act. So American, factories are busy producing for the war, and there's this kind of consumer goods gap, which West Germany is now re-industrialized. West Germany is perfect to kind of fill in and produce these consumer goods. So they become, that brings them even nearer, right? Because that is also, of course, the production of consumer good, important part of kind of also the ideological battle of capitalism versus communism. The then German chancellor says, yes, but you're keeping our men. You're keeping our men locked up on our territory. We want to be your partner in fighting communism. We want to be your partner in the Korean War. We want to be your partner in NATO. We want to have our own army again. But, in order to do that, I think it would be really great if you could release the men that are still being held on our soil, release our nationals that are still being held by you guys on our soil. So McCloy, who was, who was really, politically, again, I say it nicely, I say politically expedient, let's keep it that way. He right, exactly. And he starts, again, first commuting sentences of the industrialist sentence at Nuremberg, followed by the high-ranking SS officer sentenced to death. Now, of course, some had to be executed. Some had committed atrocities so big or were so, because it was a lot about symbolism, right? If their names were too well known or too much attached to certain crimes or atrocities,
Right.
they were killed. But there were a lot of ones who were kind of, they were, not as well known, and they were the ones whose death sentences were commuted to life sentences were
then
commuted to and released by the mid 1950s. Yeah, but even those who had murdered, American soldiers, right? Like the Malmedy massacre. You
What was
have
the Malmedy
the
massacre?
Malmedy massacre was a massacre in Belgium in the Ardennes of I think 83 American prisoners of war
When?
by Nazi soldiers in 44, I believe. And the guy who ordered their murder, right? It's of prisoners of war, American prisoners of war. Joachim Peiper, when he was released in 1955 after his death sentence had been commuted, became the head of marketing at Porsche. Was immediately hired off the street, right from death row, right into the marketing director at Porsche.
Another
Yeah.
great car. But why was he? What made him qualified to be a marketing director of Porsche as an SS officer?
Well, because Ferry Porsche, who made the brand Porsche big globally, was an honorary SS officer, and his man, his best friend, or one of his close friends, a guy named Joachim Prinzing, the two of them introduced Porsche to the U.S., where it became a huge hit in the early 1950s, and basically Ferry Porsche surrounded himself with former high-ranking SS officers in the Porsche boardroom. And his Prinzing, his best friend, was kind of tasked with doing the recruiting among former SS comrades to bring them into Porsche. That they were like, hey, if you get released, we have a good position for you, and generally these people were, highly educated, unfortunately highly intelligent, and had a position waiting for them once they were released.
Would you describe Germany? I feel like I know the answer to this question, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. Would you describe Germany today as very, very anti-Nazi, with their past, if you will?
That's such a good question. I think they, as I said earlier, right, the Germans have this perverse mix of superiority and self-hatred. What they want to do is they want to say it's our history. Like, we did that, we atoned for it. But there is this kind of sense that, they're being still confronted with it day in, day out, right? So in a sense, they're still inundated with also new revelations regarding the history. And they're slightly desensitized in a way to it as well. But I think, in many ways, it's also in a way saying it is our history. We did that, and yeah, they're anti-Nazi, but I don't know. I mean, are they? If you look now, you have the large, Germany is swinging very much to the right. I mean, there's a huge, largest opposition party, Alternative for Germany, which
Are
is
they
going
like anti certain groups? And
yeah,
stuff?
they're anti-immigration, anti-Islam, they're anti. They have some anti-Semitic tendencies. They are very much about kind of they're very much into kind of Holocaust revisionism, and they're very much into kind of again, whitewashing history. I mean, the end part of my book is also about the rise of the AfD, because one of the members. So you earlier asked about what kind of political parties do these
Yes.
business dynasties support. So there's one example in my book of the family, this kind of aristocratic family, which co-founded Allianz of Munich Re, so the world largest insurers and reinsurers back then and today, right? And they also had this private bank called Merck Fink, and the father, idealized Hitler, became Hitler's kind of main fundraiser for this big museum in Munich, and then was allowed to expropriate the Rothschild Bank in Vienna and the Dreyfus Bank in Berlin as a thank you for his service to the Nazi regime. and his son actually is suspected to be one of the founding funders of the AFD. So that's the one example in my book of a continuation of, of far right support from father to son. But that's really the exception to the rule in these families, right? I mean, that's usually they just support the establishment conservatives.
The reason I ask, or I asked at the beginning of this part of the conversation about the specific, 1945 to 1960 denazification period, and then how it relates to today, is because I haven't spent time in Germany,
right?
But you hear a lot of things about how hardcore, even like legally, they are with not letting some of these ugly things come back through the door, right? Like Annie Jacobsen wrote a book.
Yeah.
Obviously,
Operation Paperclip.
Yes, very not pro-Nazi, opposite. But the cover had a swastika on it, and she couldn't even take it into the country.
So did mine. So does mine. The American edition of my book also has a huge swastika on the cover,
but not the German edition.
Not the German edition, because that's forbidden. It's
illegal,
right? And also, my book in English is called Nazi Billionaires. In German, it's called Braunes Erbe, which means like dark inheritance, basically.
Oh wow! So they even changed the language.
Yeah.
Okay.
But also Nazi Milliardäre doesn't really sound in German, so I think it was also for aesthetic reasons. Yeah.
But point being, you laid it out well. The United States intelligence and bureaucratic regime immediately shifted towards the Cold War and kind of said, okay, let's put this behind us. And therefore, over the next 10, 15 years, they let a lot of people fall through the cracks, if you will, wittingly.
Yeah.
And some of these people, you've already laid out some examples, but I know there's even more that get into politics, ended up having power in the rebirth of Germany. And these are people who were literally a part of Nazi Germany. So the question is all right, maybe a lot of society is now against Nazism, but they're being led by some people or implicitly changed by some people who have power positions who still believe in them.
Yeah, for sure. And I actually didn't answer your question because the Nuremberg trials were one part of it, but denazification, right? So what ends up happening is that in early 1947, the Americans start handing over thousands of suspected Nazi war criminals and ardent Nazi sympathizers who weren't big enough to be indicted and tried at Nuremberg back over to West German authorities for the so-called denazification trials. And of course, there was no incentive on the side of West German authorities to judge their fellow compatriots on crimes that they had committed themselves and on sympathies that they had held themselves. So these denazification trials or committees or proceedings, however you want to name them, quickly devolved into show trials, and not of the Stalinist kind, but of the kind that everybody went scot-free, including many of the industrialists that I write about, who were under the radar, who could have been indicted before Nuremberg, but were just because of the symbolic limitation, because they only limited the Nuremberg trials to 3 industrialist trials. Again, Flick, Krupp and his managers, and the entire executive board of IG Farben. Many of them just went through denazification proceedings and were, deemed fellow travelers, got a 2,000 Deutschmark fine, and their frozen assets were returned to them, and their board positions were returned to them. Yeah, they weren't expropriated at all, except for in East Germany. In West Germany, they could keep everything. In East Germany, they were, of course, by the communists, they were wholesale expropriated, and it all became good. But the Allies returned everything to them because, again, they want to rebuild West Germany, and for that you need the industrialists, you need the companies going again, you need these large companies as well. As this was part of this kind of bulwark, of this buffer against communism, right? If West Germany is doing well, then communism won't spread, I get behind. I understand those reasons, but where it went horribly wrong was that at least, right, the Allies should have supervised these denazification proceedings and trials, because there was just a continuation of money and power from the Third Reich to West Germany, in this kind of vacuum of 5 years between 1945 and 1950, where the Allies could have done a good job of, at least attempting to denazify Germany, because that's what really one of the myths that I tried to dispel with this book as well, is denazification never happened. Not only not in the business, not only not in the business world, but on every level of German society, on education, in the legal world,
How
in the
did
medical
that happen
world.
in education and legal world?
Because all Germans had to go through denazification, and because there was no oversight, it became people weren't properly denazified. So you had judges who were prominent judges in the Third Reich resuming their positions in West Germany in the new Federal Republic, or you had a Nazi journalist who could continue on without any kind of repercussion or recourse or any kind of proceedings, because denazification failed, because there was no such thing as effective denazification.
To play like slight devil's advocate
Sure.
here, I think I agree with your point, but I just want to
Totally.
is the term steel man this a little bit? We'll figure it out. But is it possible that, I mean, judges is a tough one, but let's use the journalist example.
Yeah, sure.
Is it possible that there were some journalists who were Nazi journalists who were completely blackmailed, under the threat of death of their family, to not write what the Nazis told them to write, meaning they actually didn't believe in it, and now, they wanted to report on the other end of stuff?
No, but I mean, because if you're already under that much risk, they wouldn't even let you become a journalist. You were barred, right? Because Goebbels made sure, as Minister of Propaganda and Enlightenment, that only people were allowed to be journalists who fully subscribed to the ideals. If there was any hint of doubt, you would be scrapped as a journalist. You couldn't work for the next 10 years.
So you look at it like denazification never happened. One pushback maybe I'd have there, and again, I say this as someone who's never spent time in Germany, so it's a little hypocritical to talk to someone who spent a lot of time there. However, if society, let's say by 1975, didn't feature a lot of people, by percentage, I'm saying, in Germany who still believed in Nazi ideology, couldn't you at least say that some of it worked? We've already laid out all the holes in the system for sure. It wasn't perfect by any means, but some of it got denazified.
Yeah, but in a way, it's a process of aging and people dying off, right? But the big cultural class in Germany and in wider Europe was in *68 with the student protests, who started rising up to the generation before them and asking questions. What did my parents and grandparents do during the Third Reich?
What happened here? I don't know much about this.
So '68 was really, there was huge student protests in Germany, in France, you name it, where there was a big clash of cultures between kind of the conservative old guard and the new, hippie-ish, well, not hippie-ish is a bit, pejorative, but people who were concerned with history and saw a lot of things get swept under the rug, or saw their elders not speaking about what they did in the past. And this culture class erupted, where they were asking for more openness and transparency. And as a result, there was some violent, just like you had here in the U.S., society with SDS, which faction became the weather underground, right? Which did these bombings and these attacks and you name it. In Germany, you had the Red Army faction, for example, which and great movie has been made about it as well. Which killed high-ranking industrialists, or kidnapped high-ranking industrialists or bankers with an SS or a Nazi past.
Whoa!
Yeah.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah. And there's even 3 generations of them. There's even crazy enough. There's even recently 3 Red Army faction members who had been on the run for, I think, 30 years were recently arrested in Berlin after some, they'd been living completely undercover.
What, for doing society a service? I mean,
right,
Jesus.
Right. But they also, they did it with such they did it with such violence. I think there were also innocents hit, and it was
can't have that.
it was and I think the first generation was just kind of had decidedly ideological purity, but then the second and third generation they just sustained themselves by robbing banks and shooting innocent people. So yeah.
During the key periods of the denazification, though, one thing I keep thinking about is obviously there were multiple countries involved in this, and prominently among them the U.S., meaning you had people in these rooms who were involved in prosecutions or processes to put in place who were Jewish as well.
Guys, if you're still watching this video and you haven't yet hit that subscribe button, please take 2 seconds and go hit it right now. Thank you.
So was there like pushback behind the scenes in some of this, paper pushing that was going on from some people? Like, hey, wait a minute, like these guys were killing my people. Like we need some justice here.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately, so few people came back or survived, that stayed in Germany. That those families who did stay, they just kept their head down, and they weren't really, they didn't play major factors of.
But what about like some of the American Jewish lawyers? And there was another guy, I'm forgetting his name, who was not American. I believe he was actually German, but he was like one of the prosecutors at Nuremberg. Like guys like this.
Ben Ferenc, right?
Yeah.
Who became 101, the guy who passed away 2 years ago.
Yes, I believe that's it.
Yeah. This great silence enveloped Germany, or West Germany, following 1950, right? Following denazification, following the establishment of the Federal Republic. And Germany was doing great economically and politically, became such an important ally to the US. So there was no really need in Germany. Nobody pushed them to talk about it. And even men, brave men like Ben Ferenc or whoever, who did try to make these cases or try to initiate compensation or restitution cases against some of the industrialists. The industrialists like, man, this is history. There's no need. We're free, we're thriving. There's no need for us to have to deal with this, or we're just completely in denial to begin with. So it doesn't really become an issue until the 1990s, when Germany, when Germany is reunified, right?
Yeah.
The Iron Curtain has fallen, the Soviet Union has disintegrated, and at the same time, you have two forces happening at the same time. In the U.S., survivors of concentration camps, but also of forced and slave labor, or both, start filing mass claims against major German companies. And at the same time, you have millions of Eastern Europeans who are freed from the Iron Curtain and from the clutches of the Soviet Union, and saying, "Well, hey, we lived for 45 years, we're oppressed by the Soviet Union, but during World War II, we were also exploited by the Germans, and we want to have there needs to be some kind of reckoning here. There needs to be some kind of recourse." So what happens is that the Clinton administration in the late 1990s starts negotiating with the German federal government for a compensation for surviving forced and slave laborers. And the settlement that is agreed upon ends up where the German federal government donates 5 billion euros to this compensation fund, to a foundation actually, and German business.
5 billion?
5 billion.
Okay.
5 billion. So about 5 billion USD at the time.
Okay.
And German business as a whole pays up 5 billion euros, 5 billion USD into this foundation. Now, of the money paid by German business, 60% is paid by only 18 companies like BMW, Daimler, Volkswagen, you name it. You name all the big German brands. Thousands of companies have also greatly profited from forced and slave labor, only paying like 500 euros, like a symbolic amount. And then you have the payout to surviving for a concentration camp captive or surviving slave and forced slave laborers is at the highest, is a one-time payment lump sum of 10K. of $10,000. Which is a pittance for
Yeah,
what
yeah,
they have for what they had to go through.
And what they were robbed of, by the way.
Exactly. And most importantly, what happens is there's a clause in the settlement where the German companies say, well, we don't have to acknowledge any kind of wrongdoing, culpability, or guilt for the crimes that occurred in our factories and mines during the Third Reich. So they pay money, and not very much to begin with. But they don't take any actual responsibility for history. They don't take any moral responsibility for history, right? Because they don't have to acknowledge any wrongdoing or culpability or any form of guilt. So they can pretend now from 2000 onwards like nothing's ever happened. They've got legally, right? Which in turn allowed these families that I ended up writing about to pretend like nothing happened and pretend their father was indeed very successful in business, but leave everything else out. And I think, that, it was tabula rasa, they got a clean bill of health and they could pretend nothing bad had happened, basically, and allowed them to cover up history in plain sight. And I think that's why, they act with such impunity when it comes to history because they got a legal way out, literally.
Of the companies that you looked at and the families that you looked at and the various industries they were in, how many of them were around prior to the Treaty of Versailles?
That's a good question. Of the main families, the two main families I write about in the book, so it's the Quants, the BMW Quants, and the Flicks, the controlling shareholders of Daimler, or the former controlling shareholders of Daimler-Benz. They really made, one of the other myths I tried to dispel with the book was that, they say, people say, all these families made their money during the Third Reich. That's just not true. With the exception of the Porsche Pierre family, because of the creation of Volkswagen, which Ferdinand Porsche was commissioned by Hitler to develop, and we really laid the base for their wealth during the Third Reich. All these other families were already incredibly wealthy before Hitler seized power in January 1933. So many of them, to go back to your question, laid the foundation of their wealth during World War I, for example, by producing, like in the case of the Quants, the uniforms for the army of the German Empire. Right, or for like Flick, run steel factories, which created ammunition or was used. His steel was used to create armaments, you name it.
Which by the way, I'm sorry to cut in here, but an important distinction I think just for people out there is like in World War II you have Hitler, who I don't have to explain that and his ideology and what that is. World War I, obviously Germany was at fault and it was fucked up that like this whole war went down and everything, but there wasn't the ethnic hatred or anything like that. It was more just like a fucked up war. Meaning to me, like, and disagree with me if this is wrong, but like companies that happen to be from that country who are helping in the war effort, like, it is what it is. That's not like a horrible historical thing.
I mean, the Germans were just ended up being on the losing side, which then, were, to your point, were received these draconian, like the Treaty of Versailles, which in many ways was contributed to the rise of Hitler and everything that happened after that. So of these companies, like the Quants, for example, right, they owned. Many of, like Flick and Quant, during the hyperinflation of the early 1920s of the Weimar Republic in Germany, they buy up a lot of companies on the cheap because Germany is in such bad dire straits economically, hyperinflation. They made a lot of money. The Quants and Flicks did during World War I. They can use that to buy up. With speculating, buy up totally undervalued companies. For example, Quant bought up a company that is now a very well-known battery company as Varta, which produces the batteries in AirPods. You know, it was a huge battery company, for example.
I use those.
Right. I use those too. Yeah, guilty as charged. You know, he buys that on the cheap, right? He buys one of the largest weapons companies in Germany on the cheap. So these were companies that had been around prior to the Treaty of Versailles, you know, that had been around since the late 1890s. Of course, their post-Second World War II wealth allowed them, or the fact that the Allies allowed them to keep all their money then, is what ended up them buying BMW, or they're controlling stakes in BMW and Daimler-Benz and you name it. Right?
No, I wanted to ask that question as like kind of a prequel here so we could retrace this history, because it's important in the sense that, you know, I've always, probably once every 12 to 18 months, I study something different about Hitler's rise, because it was so fast.
Right.
And like the cyclone of things that were happening around him for it to occur, like these are the kinds of things I try to study to make sure history doesn't repeat itself. Not that I have control over that, but, you know, when you look back on it, you just mentioned it yourself, so much of the fuse was lit by that Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah.
And so I had Danny Sheehan in here for episodes 245 and 246, who's like this longtime legendary attorney who knows so much about all these things. But he broke down some of it. But for people out there who didn't hear that episode or don't know the specifics of the treaty that was signed in Treaty of Versailles in 1918, like what about that fucked Germany, like specifically, and how did that impact them in the Weimar Republic?
So it was you know, I would say twofold, but the one thing is they had to pay. They imposed the Treaty of Versailles imposed these draconian costs to be paid back by Germany, basically to the U.S., to England, the cost for the war, to France, to Russia, the cost for the war, basically, which is, you know, they could never pay that back. Right. So rather than they had lost the war, okay, you know, let bygones be bygones. No, they had to kind of double punish them by literally asking for billions at the time it was, you know, of money to be paid by Germany to kind of compensate the Allied forces for their losses, or you know, it was an added punishment, you know, with total adverse effects. Secondly, they had to disarm completely, right? And one of the things that Hitler does
breaks them.
Is initiate the largest rearmament that the world had ever seen, you know, and of course, what the industrialists and the financiers bought into in 1933 when Hitler comes to power is, and what he initially also delivers on, is this, you know, is economic stability, because there's huge economic and political upheaval during the Weimar Republic from 1918 to 1933, where you have Treaty of Versailles, you have hyperinflation, and it's bookend. That's one bookend, say 1918 to 2022.
Yep.
Well, Germany loses status as an empire, aristocracy is abolished, you know, the imperial family has to flee. And on the other bookend, you have the Great Depression. You have huge, on both sides of it, huge, enormous economic upheaval.
If I understood correctly, though, when I studied this, correct me if I'm wrong here, and I think you just said it, so I feel like this is right, but you said 1918 to 1922, hyperinflation, they're burning fucking Deutschmarks for fire.
Exactly.
1929 comes, that's what led to Hitler's really rise, because for some reason, even though Germany was still not where they had been and stuff, things did settle down from 22 to 29.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. They did. They settled down, for sure.
What caused, like, how did they settle down? Because, like you said, like, the Treaty of Versailles was crazy.
Yeah. I mean, they ended up not paying it, but there's such resentment, right? There's such resentment. There becomes this myth of being stabbed in the back. Many of many of kind of prominent Jewish citizens are being blamed. So kind of the anti-Semitic tendencies are like the fire is fueled for that, you know. So, but the resentment lingers there, right? So that also explains because Hitler, you know, kind of rise is also in that, or initial rise is in this period of stability.
That's correct.
Of, say, you know, 1923 to 1933, and you know, there is this, there's this sense, there's the myth of being stabbed in the back. But it all goes back to being declassed as a world power, having lost its status as an imperial empire, you know, which Bismarck had, you know, spent so much time doing from 1870, and then the imperial family until 1918. You know, I mean, Germany between 1870 and 1918 was a world power, and suddenly it's reduced to nothing. You know, it loses its identity, it loses its it's you know, it's demasculated in a way. You know, it's also these identities of kind of being humiliated and you know, demasculated, you know, and that, of course, that discontent, that resentment fuels this really dangerous fire, which leads to the rise of Hitler. But of course, you know, when we take then 1929 and millions of Germans becoming unemployed, you know, and there's enormous economic upheaval and political upheaval because you have three government, there's an election every year, every 6 months, you know, and, you know, even though, you know, and the Nazi party, you know, smartly plays into that with Goebbels as his chief propagandist, you know, giving easy answers to very difficult problems, right? Blaming everything on the communists, socialists, and the Jews, basically.
Where are, let's say like
1929,
1930, so a few years before Hitler actually gets power.
Yeah.
Where are these main families at the time vis-a-vis Hitler and the Nazis? Are they starting to cozy up with them behind the scenes?
No. Yeah. Well, behind the scenes, yes, but that really starts from 1931 onwards.
Why 31?
Because that's when Hitler decides to make inroads with the industrialists. Because he had no business, he had no business backing except for two industrialists. One, Fritz Thyssen, was this steel mogul, and Hugenberg, who was this media mogul.
Okay.
But the Quant and Flick, for example, get first introduced to Hitler in 1930, 1931, when Hitler decides to make inroads. It says we need money because there's going to be a power grab by the left, which never occurs, and we need to raise money from the industrialists. So they're all being called up. You know, the main characters in my book are all being called up to this suite in Berlin where they first meet Hitler, and they're like, no, this is not, you know, they're conservative, they're establishment conservatives. This guy's he's too far out there. And it is only when he you know, grabs power on January 30th, 1933, and summons the industrialists and financiers and business CEOs and business heirs, you know, to this meeting on February 20th, 1933, where Goering, his right-hand man, sends out a telegram saying, oh, the new chancellor is going to, you know, Hitler's going to explain his economic policies.
Be here or die, basically.
Exactly. But what it ends up being, that meeting, is where both Hitler and Goering very clearly, you know, tell the industrialists or the assembled businessmen, the elections of March 5th, 1933 is going to be the last election in Germany for the next 10 to 100 years.
10 to 100?
Yeah.
What a range.
What a range indeed. Yeah. It would have, 100 years on. So 2033. So they're very explicitly promise the end of German democracy, and they all get out their checkbooks and write over checks, for the last
industrialists
election, for the last election campaign of March 5th, 1933.
Now, how did they feel about doing that at the time? Was it just strictly they felt like, well, I pretty much have to, or were some of them like, we're on board with this?
No,
we
they
like
were
these
on
guys.
board. They were clearly on board with it. They were clearly on board with it. They wanted to be on the good side. They wanted to be on the side of the ruling party. They wanted economic stability, and they wanted to make this implicit. They bought into this kind of devil's pact of wanting to profit. They were buying. Most of the men I write about were few exceptions. There were opportunists.
Yeah.
Right. Not ideologues. And
who are some of these men in that room?
So it's Günter Quant.
Mm-hmm.
It's Friedrich Flick. It's August von Fink. So Günter Quant at that time, he runs AFA, the battery company, and DWM, which is Germany's largest armaments company at the time, or one of them. Friedrich Flick is in charge of his steel, coal, and weapons empire. August von Fink is the one who is his family co-founded Allianz and Munich Re, the insurers, and he also owns his private bank. And there's the CEOs of IG Farben, of Deutsche Bank. There's Siemens, there's Krupp, there's all the big German names basically are assembled there.
Big room.
24 men. 24 businessmen, and I would say a handful of Nazis. In Berlin.
How much like is the, because obviously he didn't bring any Jews in there or anything.
No.
None of those guys from that. So were a lot of these guys on board with the incoming anti-Semitic policies too?
That's not so Hitler doesn't mention that in his speeches, right? He talks about the definitive battle between the left and the right. He talks about, ending labor unions. He talks about, rearmament, but he doesn't talk about, anti-Semitic policies.
Why didn't
because a lot of them had, had Jewish board members or bankers or lawyers, you name it, who of course they start to quickly fire in the months thereafter. But at that point, that's not what Hitler promises to them. So,
Why did Hitler, what was the ideology behind Hitler hating labor unions so much? That's always like kind of skipped over. We just mentioned, he hated labor unions.
Yeah,
but what was his thought there?
Because they were made up of mostly socialists and communists. They fought for the laborers' interests, and that's why I hated them. And that is, something that, listen, I mean, you had the Soviet Union nearby. There was the industrialists mostly feared communism. That's really what their big fear was a communist takeover, which was, not an unthinkable idea, which was in the realm of possibilities. So people should understand how kind of that specter of fear was hanging over them as well. Again, on the tail end of the Great Depression, them buying into what Hitler had to sell them. But of course, it doesn't start with it devolves into criminal behavior, right? Because it starts with German rearmament and initiating the world's largest rearmament program the world had ever seen. So you soon have, by late 33, early 44, have billions of Reichsmarks flowing into the coffers and the companies of these industrialists. And, the machines, the factories are churning, again, profits are good. But it is only when the policies, when the Nuremberg race laws come into effect in mid-1935, when you have this process of, this perversely cynic term called Aryanization, which is the removal of any Jewish ownership from any asset, right?
And education too, right?
And education, right? But you're right. That there's also about Aryanization in the business context is really, which also had a veneer of legality, is really removing Jewish ownership from an asset, whether there was companies, equities, bonds, art, jewelry, you name it.
Got it.
Which also starts with a veneer of legality. you know, you have business families who are getting coerced by the Nazi authorities or by their competitors, saying, you know, sell to us, you know, at a fire sale price, or else, right? Or families wanting to sell it because they wanted to get the hell out of the country. But the second half, of course, as persecution ramps up over the second half of the 1930s, this devolves into outright theft and robbery. And this was a practice that really was continued in the German-occupied territories, no matter what, you know, what your religious beliefs or background or political beliefs were. You know, it just became outright robbery and seizure, of course, and, you know, with the low point of the mass enslavement of an estimated 12 to 20 million forced enslaved laborers.
You know how, like, today in politics, the worst kept secret is that all these people who are politicians that are up there, regardless of where they are, what country,
Right.
they're propped up by the real business people behind them who are paying them money and donating to them.
Right.
Right. So obviously at the beginning in Hitler's rise, the leverage of power here is on his end because he's like, get on board or else.
Exactly.
But then, and I think it remains that way. I just kind of want to make sure here. But like, as the 30s go on and these machines start pumping and making billions of dollars or whatever, you know, was there ever a point where any of these guys, maybe behind the scenes off the record, actually held sway over Hitler or anyone in the government on certain issues? Or was it just always totally...
They needed each other, right? Because the Nazi regime needed them to churn out weaponry. And, you know, these were not, you know, the Nazis also tried to build some state enterprises with varying degrees of success, but they were mostly reliant on private business to feed the Nazi war machine. So, you know, the industrialists, the financiers, the bankers, you name them, also had a lot of leverage over the regime. It was an interplay, right? But of course, the businessman needed you know, be on the right side of the regime in order to keep safe. And there's one example, because people always ask me, you know, did they have a choice, right? Did they have any agency? And I always give the example of Fritz Thyssen, who I mentioned earlier. This, you know, this steel mogul, who was one of two exceptions who backed the Nazi Party already from 1925, financed them. Becomes, you know, is appointed even as a member of parliament in its defunct Nazi parliament in Berlin, and then makes a stand when Germany invades Poland in September 1939, to say, I'm against this war, votes against it, subsequently flees to Paris, has an American journalist write this kind of whitewashing biography of him titled I Paid Hitler, and is subsequently arrested once the Germans invade France, thrown into a concentration camp, and loses his entire steel empire is given to Flick's right-hand man, this ardent SS officer called Steinbrink.
Did the guy die in the concentration camp?
He did not. He survives. And what ends up happening is that because he was one of the first backers of Hitler, the Allies also indict him and sentence him to 3 years in prison. So he gets it both. He gets punished twice, right? So all these guys who just end up saying nothing and just profiting, right?
Yeah.
They get off scot-free, and this guy who actually makes a stand before the war, and the war ends up, actually gets up punished twice by the Nazis and the Allies, and actually ends up dying quickly after his release from Allied captivity in a car accident in 1950.
A car accident?
No, yeah. I think, I'm a firm believer in that. You know, he didn't. You know, he didn't have much
You
to
always
hide
gotta
at that.
check.
Yeah,
You always gotta check, you know?
yeah. He didn't have too much. He didn't have much to hide at that point.
There's been some interesting car accident stories in the
Certainly.
studio.
Oh, I'm
so
sure.
I
I'm
always
sure.
got to make
I'm sure.
sure.
I'm sure.
You know.
I haven't delved into that one. Maybe I should. Maybe I should delve into
Yeah.
the Thyssen car accident.
You delve and get back to us.
Yeah,
on
I
that
will.
one.
I will.
So they throughout the 30s, as the Aryanism laws are coming in, and all the other laws we hear about that happen in Germany, these companies are pumping up money, and it sounds like, based on your reporting, pretty much all of them whether it was just, well, we have to go along with it, or like we're very excited to go along with this.
Yeah.
They just pumped right into World War II and were the main drivers behind everything from, well, I don't know the specifics of some of your companies, but like obviously Hugo Boss made the uniforms, Mercedes-Benz was involved in vehicle productions, BMW.
Siemens, IG Farben, and they also had some of them, had specific arrangements with the SS. They would get so-called satellite concentration camps or
Satellite?
satellite concentration camps built on their factory complexes where they would lease. And this is really horrific, but they would lease from the SS concentration camp captives. They would pay, of course, these men and women were enslaved, right? So
they would lease them.
They would lease them. They would pay the SS 4 Reichsmark per day for an unskilled concentration camp captive, and 8 Reichsmark for a skilled concentration camp captive.
What was the difference?
And well, that's a good question, right? Some had particular skills that these companies like BMW or IG Farben or Siemens or Krupp or the Quant and Flick companies or Utker, which is another family I write about, would pay DSS to hire to perform certain things in their factories, right? Of course, DSS would then build a sub concentration camp or satellite concentration camp on the factory premises, which would guard them. Of course, the conditions in the camps were horrific, but they would also guard the factories close by, and people would be horrifically abused, have the most horrible work and injuries. Would die, in factories as well, and that's really, I would say, also in terms of the, at the bottom rung of the so-called forced and slave labor hierarchy, where the concentration camp captives were leased out. Or were leased by the SS, or leased out by the SS to various German companies, and there's many kind of famous collaborations between Auschwitz and IG Farben, between BMW and Dachau.
What was BMW and Dachau? I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, Dachau would deliver, or the SS running, of course, all these concentration camps and extermination camps would lease out concentration camp captives in concentration camp Dachau to a BMW factory where they would be enslaved and perform labor there, and being beaten and malnourished, in the process.
Was like BMW, for example, I'm just thinking out loud here, during the war, are they just producing like cars for the army?
So they're all everything's being retooled as an arms factory, right?
So they're just building like
they're building parts for tanks. They're building, there's not a lot of civilian build. There's very little civilian production going on. It's all to feed the Nazi war machine. Not only BMW, but Daimler Benz. All everything is for military purposes, basically.
This feels like a dumb question, but I do find myself always thinking this when I hear about the history or read about it. Like, how did they build so many of these camps? And as you just threw a new term out there, like satellite camps, so quickly. Also, seemingly like half the time in the middle of like a war that they were fighting on at one point, like 4 fronts.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a very good question. I mean, the complex of satellite concentration camps, I mean, they numbered thousands, right? And many of them were only held a few hundred concentration camp captives that were leased out to a specific company, right? But it was, you didn't need many guards or that many people to guard people that were enslaved and malnourished and, and held captive. Right, so
but the facilities.
But they let the slaves build the camp themselves, right? So you had 12 or 16 guards, have the concentration camp captives build the camp, and then subsequently, once it finished, imprison them there, and then have them exploit them in the nearby factories, right? And there were countless of examples. Of major ones, a major example is, for example, the Volkswagen factory, which was at the time it was the largest car factory in the world, which was modeled after the River Rouge factory in Detroit, Michigan. Because Hitler idealized Henry Ford. Henry Ford
I think he
idealized
idolized
Hitler.
him, yeah.
Exactly. It was mutual love. Yeah, it was mutual. Yeah, exactly. And Hitler has tasked Ferdinand Porsche to build out the Volkswagen, the people's car, which doesn't end up going to the people under the Nazi regime. The 500 cars that are delivered all go to the Nazi elite. Instead,
by the way, oh, you know what? Go ahead.
No.
Let's finish
All
this
right.
point because it's a separate point.
Ferdinand Porsche and his son-in-law Anton Pierre were the two patriarchs of what is now the Porsche-Pierre dynasty. End up running the Volkswagen factory in the center of Germany, and you have tens of thousands of forced and slave laborers there.
The Porsches do.
Yeah, the Porsche too.
Okay.
Yeah, including thousands of concentration camp captives, and they have all these mini concentration camps on the premises of the Volkswagen factory, and you even there, and that's really horrific. Women who were pregnant, they had to give up their babies, and you ended up having about 365 babies dying from malnourishment in an orphanage close to the Volkswagen factory under the most horrific circumstances, right? In addition to the thousands of people that die from malnourishment and maltreatment at the Volkswagen factory.
And the people overseeing this are people who have foundations named after them today. That's heavy. It's... I get how you can compartmentalize, like, okay, well, this is the past, whatever, but I don't understand the stupidity of not removing those names. Like, why not name it after the sons of them or something who weren't there?
Right, or just rename it the BMW Foundation.
Sure.
Yeah, but I always think so. My argument, so I think it's I argue for radical transparency. So if you, because I think so often renaming is also a way of removing the past, right? So I think if you so want to name whatever, global foundation or you name, museum, or you name it after these men, then at least at the bare minimum, just own up to history, because you only learn from history by showing the good and the bad, right? If you only show the good, it's a whitewash. And if you don't want to commit to that, which is not, nobody's asking for more money. You don't have to pay anybody. You just have to own up to history. You have to take responsibility for that.
Learn from it.
You have to learn from it. Exactly. So if you don't want to do that, you should rename it. But I think the first choice, particularly to these private families, these private businesses, right, where you have very little leverage over, you say you make it private, it's a simple offer. It's a simple offer. You don't. It's not like with municipalities or cities or you name it, where you have, where you can through the ballot box, or where you can complain at a city council. No, these are private families. These are private companies. I mean, you can buy a share and you can go to an annual general meeting and say, hey, what about, can I have a what
Sure.
about this and that? But other than that, there's very little leverage that one has over the controlling shareholders of a company, except through public scrutiny, or sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Absolutely.
And by asking out of them.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. Like that's a huge problem I have in the way we talk about history in modern society. Like, people either want to just focus on all the good or they want to focus on all the bad,
Right.
It feels like. And it's like, you just have to put out what happened and let everyone see that for everything that's, everything that could possibly be, downstream effects, or, even within great empires or whatever you want to call them, where terrible things happen. We had slavery in this country. That's a pretty fucking terrible thing, or in places that were evil, where like nothing good happened,
Right.
like Germany, where, probably the only I mean, like auto bonds or something, I guess, is like pretty impressive. But there's not like they were this very quick rising movement that said something about human nature
Right.
that we can learn from to
right.
see how quickly people can get behind things. And what's so fascinating about the angle you take is you're looking at it from the thing that, unfortunately, it's tacky to say, but it's 100% true when you look at human nature. You're looking at it from the thing that it always comes back to, which is follow the money, because that is what people that is what motivates people. And so what I see here is a story of not just like, okay, you have this horrible guy Hitler rise with this ideology, but also you have people who are opportunists, who have some level of power through the industry they have, who are simply looking at the dollars and cents of their bottom line to get behind whatever's going to happen next without thinking about all the downstream effects of murder and devastation that they're going to cause to tens of millions of people around the world. And that's the part of this history that should not be lost.
And I think that's really, I mean, you hit a key thing, because it's really that there is a complete lack. I think what shocked me the most in doing the research, and maybe I went into it naively, is a complete lack of reflection on the side of the patriarchs, right? Well, again, they would have thrived in any political system. You know, they thrived in the German Empire, they thrived in the Weimar Republic, they thrived in Nazi Germany, they thrived in Allied, they thrived in West Germany, they thrived in reunified Germany. And I would argue they would have even come out on top in a communist system, right? Is that their only focus was profit, and the complete lack of regard of lives and people's livelihood, you know, is what really shocked me, you know, both during the events themselves between 33 and 45, as well as post-war, the post-war total unwillingness of any kind of acknowledgement, you know, when they're faced with restitution or compensation claims, you know, that they fight them on jurisdictional issues. They would fight them tooth and nail, you know, and they're just a complete lack of acknowledgement, and which is something that also trickled over to their heirs, which we talked about earlier, where it becomes more of an identity issue or a standing issue or a almost a PR management issue, which they are so afraid to engage in and rather have it swept under the rug than come clean about it.
You also have a not parallel, but what's the word I'm looking for? There seems to be a rising issue today with relitigating the past in unfortunate ways, and
Right.
let me explain what I mean by that. We're going to get to in a little later some of your current work where you're reporting on the ground, like in Israel, which obviously has a lot going on right now. And there are people who are very upset about these various wars around the world. There's two big
Right.
ones going on, one of them being Israel. And there's people who are upset with Israel's government right now.
Yeah.
And so a downstream effect of that I'm seeing, and don't get me wrong, I appreciate free speech and the ability to litigate these things in
Right.
public, but that's what I'm going to do right now. A downstream effect of what I'm seeing is people are re-wondering about some of the history of World War II. And what I mean by that is you are seeing a movement, for example, of people saying that, like, ooh, actually Winston Churchill was the bad guy in World War II, not Hitler. And they're not even saying, like, not Hitler. They're like, well, he was bad too, but Winston Churchill had every chance to stop these wars and just said, no, let's do it. And what I always say is, like, there's no one in history who's perfect. There's no one, especially given the time and the things
Right.
that are going on. Like, there are human flaws, drastic human flaws at every point of history you study. But isn't it pretty, like, concerning that people are now trying to change the narrative to potentially, like, you talk about all these families with their money whitewashing history, but now even the people that they were associated with who were the power structures causing this whole thing, we have a subset of society that's trying to say, like, well, maybe they were actually, you know, some of this was bad, but they had a point or two. Like, isn't that a long-term problem if we
That's
continue
terrifying.
that pattern?
That's terrifying, but I mean, it is, unfortunately, it is also natural development. And you were just saying earlier about, hey, it's only it's only 79 years ago, right? I mean, we get to meet and interview World War II veterans, you know, who hold so much wisdom and have fought for our lives to be, and our families' lives to be as good as they are today, right? But the unfortunate thing is that as time progresses, these things are forgotten, and that's also, especially in a time of incredible misinformation globally, you know, is why it's so important to hold the most powerful actors in the world accountable for history, and not demand too much as well, because you know ask for a bare minimum, which is you know, when you hold such power, the least you can do is be honest about your history.
Yes.
That's really the least. And nobody's asking anything else of you. You don't have to pay money. There's nothing. There's no more. You don't have to apologize for anything. It's just you just have to be honest about history. That's it.
Yeah.
Because it's so important in this day and age where people are forgetting things rapidly. People are intentionally, unintentionally misconstruing things for their own benefit, for their own purposes. You know, and that's very dangerous, because it's, you know, that's where, you know, that's where misinformation comes from.
Yeah.
And you know, to ask that from the most powerful actors in a society is again, it's a bare minimum. And I think that, you know, that's like one of the very few things they can commit to. They should commit to.
Well, I want to get to your investigation. Like we've been getting there all day with the context, but we talked about this at the very beginning. You had essentially like a 4-year deep dive. You ended up, so you leave Bloomberg in 2017 and you moved to Berlin.
Yeah. I leave New York and I moved to Berlin, October 2017, and you know, with a book contract and an advance, and I just dive into the research in Germany.
So you had written articles on.
I'd written exactly. The basis of the book proposal was the series of articles that I wrote about these families and these companies.
And that was from originally seeing that website with the Quants?
Yes, basically the first one from 2013, which had a headline: Nazi Goebbels step grandchildren are hidden billionaires. Which is also like, you know, I think it was like the most read. It was juicy. I think it was the most read, or the second most read story of Bloomberg for 2013. You know, because it was just such a. It was a great headline.
Was that the year the Samsung story came out?
What was
Bloomberg?
the Samsung story?
Where they did like the whole, I forget his name, but the leader of Samsung and how he rebuilt the whole company. It was like this long 30-page story or something. It was like one of their cover ones. I wonder if that was the other one that was like the most read.
No, the other most read I remember was uncovering the woman who owned In-N-Out Burger as one of the richest women in America. That was the story that was even more read.
So uncovering hidden money was essentially the theme of the year.
Yeah, they love, especially Bloomberg readers love reading about that, because it's always about who has more money, basically.
So that's your first one, though, and then you write a series more.
Then I write about the Oetker family, which is also one featured in the book. They were really Nazi ideologues. The Oetker dynasty owns Germany's largest beer brewer. They own, you know, a slew of luxury hotels around the world, but they're mostly known for their budding mixes and baked goods. But they're really a family full of Nazis, and the patriarch was actually an SS officer who was trained at Dachau concentration camp, and so, you know, that was, you know, and frozen pizzas is another one of their staples. So it was
in
really,
Germany.
Yeah.
That's got to be shitty pizza.
Yeah. It's a staple among students. Dr. Oetker pizzas, they're huge in the UK. That's the only one of the families where their products aren't as big in the US, but they're like big in Canada. They're big all over Europe and in many other parts of the world. So there was a second article.
If you ever bring German pizza in here, just on the basis of culture, you're fired. Just want to throw that out there, but go ahead.
Fair enough. Fair shot, Julian. and thirdly, I wrote about the Flick dynasty, so the former controlling shareholders of Daimler-Benz, and one branch of them has the world's youngest twins as billionaires, and it goes into kind of the refusal of that branch to pay into any kind of compensation or restitution funds.
When did the twins rise to power? Like,
they were born in, I think, 1999. Yeah, they're like 25 now.
oh, so they're young.
Yeah, exactly. They're young. Yeah, and their
Okay.
mother is kind of this evil matriarch who refuses to acknowledge anything. Yeah,
And
yeah.
her father, whatever.
Her father-in-law was the one who was Friedrich Flick, was the guy who was sentenced to at Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and actually ended up for the book because, of course, I reached out to all the families. I asked them. All right, I got a lot of decline to comments. The interview request declined. Spokespeople who gave such non-answers to my answers that it was really, it didn't really. It was total double speak or like corporate speak. But there was one grandson of Friedrich Flick, who was 80, who, I think was very telling in his complete lack of distance, the inability to distance himself from his grandfather. When he said, yes, many bad things have come out about my grandfather. Mind you, again, he was he was Germany's most legendary industrialist of the 20th century, but he was also a Nuremberg sentenced war criminal. But he gave us so much more than wealth alone, right? So he was quite candid in the conversation that I had with him over email and such, but he wasn't able to distance himself from it. And even as somebody as reflective as he was, if he already couldn't distance himself from his grandfather's legacy, then from those children like the BMW Quants or the Utgers or the Porsches will like celebrate their father so much. And also having done these horrific crimes, they have complete seeming lack of distance to the subject.
Before you got to the book and you were writing the
Yeah.
3 articles at least that you mentioned,
Yeah.
what did you have also? So you had family sources,
Yeah.
and what other kinds of sources were you tracking down to be able to like put the case together?
So what
initially?
Germans or what these families always do, which is a super interesting MO, is that whenever kind of a scandal breaks in Germany about beloved company X or beloved patriarch Z, is that, we're going to open up our archives, we're going to commission an academic study.
An academic study.
Yeah. And, we're going to lay it all out there. So what happens, they quickly pacify the subject, right? 4 or 5 years later, you have an academic tome published in, 1,200 pages in academic German, which, of course, never reaches a audience in Germany, which is, again, inundated and desensitized alone, on the
Why
daily.
not?
Because they're not going to read a 1,200-page book on some family.
Right, yeah.
Right? Yeah. So it's only discussed in academic circles. They're never translated. So the details never reach a global audience.
They don't have Spark Notes in Germany?
Right. Yeah, I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do. The Germans are so diligent, I'm sure they have Spark Notes.
I'm so happy
Yeah.
you got that, by the way. Yeah. I was really worried that was going to be before your time. That's good that you know Spark Notes. Thank you.
And so these academics, which are very well done, right? But now the family can say, "Hey, listen, we have this study that nobody's ever read. But we've done all our due diligence. It's all there. Nobody ever reads it, and they can go on pretend again on a global consumer-facing level like nothing's ever happened before."
Mm.
So these studies were a big help. Archives, some of them again, as part of these studies, have donated their archives somewhere in Germany, have their own archives, so access those, which is a big part of the book research. And just interviewing a lot of people, money managers, academics, journalists in Germany, meeting with them and getting the inside story and bring it to a global audience.
What were some of the higher ups at Bloomberg saying as you were publishing these articles over those few years? I mean, they were obviously doing well, so they liked that. But like, were they the ones pushing like, "Oh, you should really do the book on this, or was that more?
No, it was
from
more
you?
my colleagues. You know, I mean, my higher ups just wanted more of those kind of stories. They loved you know, my editors, my bosses, they loved that. But it was more my fellow reporting colleagues who said, "Hey, you should really, you're onto something here. You should really write a book on it."
So you decide to write the book. You
Yeah.
leave Bloomberg in 2017. You move to Berlin, and you spend 4 years on it. Now you already had, like, it sounds like, friends and contacts in Germany.
No,
at that point.
not really.
No,
when I
you
arrived
didn't.
there, I really, because you
So
know,
you went
also,
blind. Wow.
sorry, yeah, I went in. Yeah, I went in blind. Yeah, I went in blind. You know, because growing up, even though it's our neighboring country, right? I would never really go to Germany. I didn't go to Germany until I was 18. You know, to Berlin, which I immediately
Oktoberfest?
loved. No, I've never been to Oktoberfest. I'm so embarrassed to admit this. I've been to Munich so many times. I've never been to Oktoberfest. I was so close to going, like twice or three times, and I just never ended up going.
It'll happen for you.
Yeah, I hope so. I have my Junker, and well, I'm not gonna wear lederhosen. That's too much. But I have my Bavarian my Bavarian jacket ready.
There you go.
It's a cool jacket, actually.
So you had to build this network from scratch. When
I
you
had to
get
build
on
this
the ground.
network from scratch. But the weird thing is that I ended up in this group of friends in Berlin. There was a lot of ties to the past there. Like one was like a great grandson of the chancellor who put Hitler into power, like von Papen.
Yeah.
Yeah. It became a good friend of mine, Eric. You know, and there was this other woman who was the granddaughter of von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign secretary.
Yes.
And, you know, they would all, you know, I got to know them in Berlin, and they were this kind of social group, and I kind of fell in with them, and they were all super intrigued about my research, and they knew many of the families I wrote about, of course. But that was super weird.
So all like the grandkids
Yeah,
and great grandkids of like the evil people are friends.
Yes, basically.
And you're friends with them.
Yes, and I'm friends with that, or friendly with them.
This is like the anti-Avengers or something.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, it's like a new season of The Boys, you know.
But they like the research you were
They
doing.
liked the
That's
research,
pretty
yeah,
cool.
because it wasn't about their families, because they were generally, by and large, they were, you know, impoverished aristocracy, or, you know.
They're like, get the blame off
Exactly,
us.
exactly. You know, they weren't part of these. You know, of these business dynasties. Although they often intermarry, right? Like, because the business people want the aristocracy, they want the castle.
Yeah.
The castle people don't have the money, so they want the money. They want the stable dividend, annual dividends. You know, that's often marriage of convenience that often still happen in Germany. You know, Germany is very
day.
good at pretending to be a class society, not to be a class society, even though it very much is.
They try to pretend not to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if they're marrying each other, it's
Yeah,
obvious.
but people, like the 85 million people in Germany, they don't really know
They don't
about
know
this
that.
world. No.
So they don't
Yeah.
have like a New York Times marriage section.
No.
Where you see all the powerful people.
No,
marry each other?
no. Exactly. No, they don't do that. They
I'm
do
only-
not. You know, the Germans are so discreet, right? The Germans are so
I didn't
discreet.
know that,
The Germans are super discreet.
No, I'm not
No,
like.
especially compared to the Americans. It's like, you know, it's like, yeah, they're, you know, no, they're I would say they're the opposite of the US in that way. They're super low key. They never want to show their wealth. You know, they're like terrified of it. Yeah.
Yeah, because like I still see that today, and I'm like, it'll be like the son of this billionaire
Exactly.
married. I'm like, I don't think I'd want that in the papers these days.
No,
like
you
just the way
don't.
society
You don't.
is,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, that's true.
So they're not doing that in Germany.
Yeah.
But point being, some of these people who are descended from central characters are helping introduce you to at least like ideas or potential sources sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes they say, hey, you should talk to this or this person, but it was generally me, you know, going after. They would often have like anecdotes of people they had met at a party who were from the families I wrote about. That they could say so and so. They could share their own experiences with me about some of these people that they had met, which I loved.
So they're not just like opening up like a Nazi phone book or something. Like,
No, that's not. Yeah,
all right.
no,
That doesn't exist.
No,
You
no.
can tell me. No one's
No,
listening.
yeah, exactly. No, there's no Nazi phone book, or at least not that I'm aware of. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So did you have a moment? Because it's a long period, 4 years, but I don't know, in the first year there or something, did you have like a really memorable breakthrough moment where you're like, whoa, we got something here?
It was, I'm going to have to disappoint everybody, but it was really kind of just a day-to-day grind.
Day-to-day grind.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just like,
What are you doing?
It's just constructing a narrative, you know, it's reading through documents, it's reading books. It's like, how have we come to this moment? Kind of how did we, right? Because the history kind of served as a backstory to the contemporary cover-up.
Yes.
So it's reconstructing that and being super, being, very detail oriented, that everything checks out. So it is, I feel that in the end, I felt that, I think closer to publication, the book came out in late April 2022. I felt close to publication. I published this essay for New York Times, for example, or that's an excerpt in Forbes about the pushing out of Porsche's Jewish co-founder. This is a guy called Adolf Rosenberger, where I felt like, okay, these are stories that nobody's ever heard before,
Wait,
and they
Porsche
will
had a
resonate.
Jewish
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, who was erased from company history.
Whoa.
So you had Ferdinand Porsche, who we talked about, right? The guy who is commissioned by Hitler to develop the Volkswagen. You have his son-in-law, Anton Pierre, who's a combative legal counsel. But the third co-founder of the Porsche car design firm was a commercial director. It was a Jewish guy named Adolf Rosenberger, who was a former race car driver too. And the three of them established Porsche, or the Porsche car design firm, in 1930. Adolf Rosenberger is pushed out in 1935 for being a Jew. He has to give up his 10% stake in Porsche to Ferdinand Porsche's son, a guy named Ferry Porsche, who later makes the Porsche into this global brand, right?
Whoa.
Rosenberger is subsequently erased from Porsche company history.
Did he flee the country?
He did. He fled to the U.S. He established himself. He lands in Los Angeles. And in the end, in 1950, because he wants to be compensated for being pushed out for having his stake Aryanized and being pushed out of the company. His lawyers settle with the Porsche Pierre clan behind his back, where he gets 50,000 Deutschmark and a choice between a Porsche sports car or a Volkswagen Beetle.
Gee, thanks.
And his 10% stake in Porsche would have been worth $7 billion.
Yeah.
Would have been worth $7 billion today, because at the time my book was published in April 2022, Porsche is in the process of spinning out, or the Porsche Pierre clans are in the process of spinning out Porsche from the Volkswagen Group and listing it separately on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. So they were doing road shows. So they were meeting investors, institutional investors in the US, in the UK, and pitching Porsche to them. Hey, invest, become a cornerstone investor in our company, right? One of the most recognizable brands in the world. But my story, my book hits, my essays published in the Times, and institutional investors, particularly in the US, started asking, the Porsche Pierres and their bankers and lawyers, if you're going to lie about your history, are you also going to lie about your finances? So the SEC document of the Porsche listing has a clause saying revelations regarding the period from 1933 to 45 may come out that may adversely impact the share price. Yeah. And as a result of the book, the Porsche Pierre clan made this moral settlement with the heirs of Adolf Rosenberger, where they provided for this moral settlement because the financial settlement had happened already in 1950, where they would rewrite Rosenberger back into Porsche history.
Oh, they did?
Yes. Well, they are in the process of doing that, because this settlement happened late October 1st, 2022.
Whoa.
It's going to happen in 2025. And even, and as a result, and there was also the Forbes excerpt that I wrote, and as part of the Times essay, I was recently contacted by the Automotive Hall of Fame in Dearborn, Michigan. They said they have pretty strict protocol, and they said, well, we've inducted Ferdinand Porsche and Anton Pierre in our Hall of Fame, and we wanted to induct Ferry Porsche, but actually we work on a chronological basis, and we found your article on Adolf Rosenberger, and we're actually now considering to induct him into the Hall of Fame, being one of the original co-founders of Porsche. So
That's kind of cool.
That is cool. That is cool. And I think, for somebody who made such a huge contribution as well to automotive history, and was erased from that history because of the Nazis, because of who he was, I think he's finally getting the credits that he deserves.
All right, so there's one
there's
positive outcome.
Yeah, there's a positive
little
outcome.
Okay.
There's a positive outcome. That's one positive
Yeah,
outcome.
because so much of this is dark. That's a good thing to see. So I guess we'll see that finish in the next year or two, as far as like officially getting.
Exactly. So they commissioned the study. Porsche financed with the contributions of the heirs of Adolf Rosenberger, who live out in Claremont, California. And there's going to be an English edition, and Adolf Rosenberger is getting his rightful place in history back.
Cool.
But that is only because the Porsche Pierres felt the financial pressure, felt they had something to lose in this IPO.
Yeah.
Right? They were being confronted with their past in uncomfortable ways, which forced them to clean house. Now that is, of course, a very exceptional case. Another case in the book, which is an even crazier story, I give that at the end of the book as a kind of counterexample to all the other families I write about, is about a family called the Rymans, and they own all these American consumer brands. They own 7-Up, Snapple, Keurig Green Mountain, Einstein's Bros Bagels.
All the shit that's poisoning us.
Exactly. Krispy Kreme donuts.
Robert F. Kennedy somewhere
exactly.
We got to get them out of this country right now.
Panera Bread. And many other brands.
I like Panera Bread. That one I like. Sorry.
And so they're owned by the Rymans, and the Rymans had this insane story where their father and their grandfather were these huge, virulent anti-Semites, huge Nazi sympathizers, and which all is revealed in 2019. They're confronted with it. Germany's largest tabloid breaks a story on their dark Nazi history. 3 months later, they come out with a major interview in the New York Times saying, yes, our father and grandfather were Nazis, but actually our father, and this is where it gets really crazy, their father was married, had a childless marriage, and had a relationship on the side with a woman, who he fathers three children with. They're the controlling shareholders today of this entire consumer goods empire.
Oh, the three bastards are.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yes. Their grandfather was murdered in the Holocaust for being a Jewish as a Jew. So the one side, the paternal side were the Nazis. The maternal side, their grandfather was a Jewish man who was murdered. So they stem from both perpetrator and victim, right?
Put that one in the shrink's office.
Right, exactly. And not only that, they're Germany's new wealthiest dynasties, making all that money off Krispy Kreme donuts, Einstein Bros bagels, you name it. And actually end up putting their money where their mouth is and renaming their foundation after the man who was murdered, after their grandfather, funding it in perpetuity for 250 million euros every 10 years, but also being transparent. Yeah.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah. They have a lot of money, estimated at 40 billion. And they're still transparent about who their Nazi father and grandfather was. Now, of course, that case is can be replicated, right? There's no other German business dynasty with a story like that, but at least that's also a positive example of some folks who did good.
Yeah, I guess that's just like, I mean, you don't have listen. You don't have control over where you're born or how you're born. Totally. I understand that. So you do with what you can with what you got, and at least they seem to be doing the right thing. Yeah. But they're also motivated by the fact that they are simultaneously like familial victims of it.
Exactly. Right. And they run this empire with brands where if you're a Nazi family and you own Einstein Bros bagels, you know, that's not a great look.
I didn't even think.
You know, that's not a great look. Yeah. So
Oh, that's so bad.
yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't even think of the name on that one. Ooh.
Yeah. But all the headlines by like all the American people was like owners of Krispy Kreme donuts, you know, confess to their Nazi past and things like that. It was they ate it up. Yeah.
You know, side point here. Why did I don't know if you like came across this in your studies, but why did the Nazis not like, I don't know, forcibly imprison people like Albert Einstein and let them flee? I mean, I'm glad they did let them flee, but like let them flee when, you know, they were Jewish, so they didn't like them, obviously, but they had useful talents that they could have put to work in like slave labor.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Einstein had already gotten out before the Nazis seized power, or
He did?
Or I think in like 1933 or 34, right? People could arguably still flee. Well, they could flee as, you know, if they successfully attempted so, you know, even during the war. But you know, most of them had to flee before 38, 39, before the war broke out.
Okay, because I know they did end up, obviously they did end up putting people of, you know, you mentioned earlier, like guys who were engineers, might have been used as slave labor in factories and stuff like that. But there were some brilliant, like world-changing scientific minds that, like, you know, they let walk out the door, and I'm glad they did. It's just like, it's like almost strange to me.
Yeah, yeah, because I guess they weren't that forward thinking, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't have this. They didn't have this. There was not that grand plan in mind of how it all should end up. You know, I think that those decisions only came during the war.
Yeah, there's also I always struggle with the simultaneous stupidity, if you will, scientifically speaking, of some of these Nazis, in the sense that, to put an example on it, you have a guy like Werner von Braun,
right,
who, objectively speaking, when it comes to rocketry and that stuff, was a fucking genius.
Totally.
He was the best in the world, and later, you know, was Operation Paperclipped over here. But that guy, at the same time, seemingly from all the evidence we can review, was able to, as a scientific mind, get behind some of the Nazi ideology of, like, you know, racial disparities and all that stuff, to the point that, you know, he was a guy who enslaved Jewish people, and the slowest one he'd shoot.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Oh,
Like,
I didn't realize that.
So, like, I think that was him. We can check that. But, you know, some of these guys, like, they were like that. It's like, you ever think about how a guy like that smart could also be that fucking stupid at the same time?
Yeah, I mean,
and evil?
Yeah, I mean, some people just ate up the propaganda, right? Or they became just brainwashed by being just too much, you know, too deep in with the regime. But it's interesting because a guy like Ferdinand Porsche, for example, right, who was, you know, Hitler called like the greatest engineer of the Nazi regime, and etc. You know, he received all these awards, but he would never, you know, he was clearly a sole opportunist, right? He was not, I mean, he would do everything in that opportunism to get ahead, you know, and it didn't matter to him whether he, you know, whether he killed thousands of people in his factory as a result of it. But there was not, you know, contrary to his son-in-law or his actual son, who both joined the SS voluntarily, you know, and were really, you know, just ideological Nazis. He was somebody who you know, steered clear of the ideological part by and large, you know, but still was responsible for the murder of thousands of people.
Yeah, can't get away from that. Well, you were mentioning a little bit ago that one, like, email back and forth with the grandson,
right?
80-year-old. Who was that again? Who was his grandfather?
So he is the Friedrich Flix. He's Friedrich Flix's grandson.
Okay.
You know, and he was the only one to correspond on the record with me for the book.
So he was the only one.
Yeah, on the record of the heirs, right?
Okay.
Of the heirs.
So the question would be, without going into things that are off the record that you can't share, of the, let's say, unnamed people off the record that you spoke with.
Yeah, or background. Yeah.
So I'm assuming this is like kids or grandkids or nephews, stuff like that. What were there any conversations that also stood out like that one in particularly, without devolving the exact details here, obviously?
You know, they all follow a similar pattern, right? Few of them want, and I do have to say, as I view it, and that's also where the book ends. You know, I think it is up to those. It is up to the current generation. So I'm not saying our generation, right? But it is up to those who were born directly after the war, or like as late as, you know, the fourth generation, for example, has nothing to do with these crimes anymore. It has nothing to do with taking responsibility for these crimes anymore, right? It is, in my view,
The fourth generation.
yeah, because at one point you're too far away
Too
from
dismissed,
it,
yeah.
you know. And again, you know, they're not. It's not. You know, these people shouldn't inherit the sins of their father. It's about the responsibility one has for their fortunes, and kind of coming clear with that, you know, and coming into clean with that. And I do think it is up to, and that's also kind of the argument I make at the end, in the epilogue of my book, of the children and grandchildren of those patriarchs that I'm writing about, to do to implement this you know, this moral responsibility towards history. But I think at one point, you know, for the next generation, or the current generation, you know, it's already too far removed. So I wasn't going to write about, you know, when I write about the heirs, it's about the children of those
Right.
that are renamed, that the children of those patriarchs, that these foundations and all these other institutions are named after, or grandchildren. But the next generation, in my view, you know, it's too far to
I think
reckon
that's
with
fair.
it.
Yeah, I think there has to be a line
Totally.
somewhere. I mean, if we didn't have one, we'd be blaming people for like what some king did
Exactly.
1,500 years ago.
Exactly.
you know?
Exactly. There's also just, you know, again, it's not about the money, right? It's about the responsibility towards history,
Yeah.
which is way more immediate with the children and the grandchildren who, you know, have still experienced their parents or grandparents and have decided to honor them in such perverse
Yes.
ways.
Yes.
Right. And I think the fourth generation has nothing to do with that anymore. So that's why it needs to be solved now. That's why there's also this immediacy, or more immediacy to it. Because you also relieve your next generation from this issue, right? You don't have to
Absolutely.
burden them with that anymore.
Did
And I think
you
it's also really unfair to do so.
did any of your investigations end up running into somehow, or like through rabbit holes into the rat lines and South America?
So the closest I got to that, so I talked about this Utker guy, right? This the guy who was trained as an SS officer in Dachau, who becomes one of West Germany's largest, or most prominent and wealthiest industrialists after the war. So he actually teams up with his former, or finances his former SS comrades through this thing called Silent Help, which was co-founded by Himmler's daughter, to help either imprisoned SS men after their release, or have SS men who were on the run flee to things like flee to places like South America. And so there's, you know, I found this conversation of where this Utker guy, actually with his best friend, who's this Rudolf von Ribbentrop, who's the son of the Nazi, of the foreign secretary,
Yeah.
right? So the uncle of
Your
this
friend.
woman I got to know in Berlin. You know, they're talking about the best way to donate in the 1950s, talking about the best way to donate money, you know, where it's still like where you could expense it, like where they could funnel it through the corporation. So they said they could expense their donations to this SS, to the Silent Help thing, where it was more tax, where it was fiscally friendly to donate it via the corporation.
And they
which
could
he owned.
access it wherever they sent it to.
Well, exactly. Well, the people could, you know, then if they donate if they got it to Silent Help, right? Stille
Yeah.
Hilfe it was called. They are the people who would then be responsible for dispersing it to whomever.
How do you know how they would do that? Are these like couriers?
Yeah,
going?
it's probably a courier thing. Yeah,
Whoa.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that history blows my mind. The rat lines will never cease to amaze me.
Yeah, it's
and what
incredible.
that
Yeah,
is.
yeah. Philip Sands. I mean, the book, The Red Line. You know, and I know there's a third because East West Street is the first of his trilogy. Then The Red Line, and I think there's a third one coming. I mean, these were incredible.
So
books.
he's alive. Philip Sands?
Philip Sands is alive. Yeah, Philip Sands is alive. Get him on the show.
Yeah,
for
we
sure.
got to get him in here.
Yeah, he's in England. He's a
I'll get
human
him
rights
here.
he's a human rights lawyer. He's a big deal. He's great. He's
I
an
would
incredible
love to do
author. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've told this story a few times on various podcasts. So for people who've heard this, just bear with me. But I feel like
I
feel like
heard
for
it. I'm
context,
excited.
you should
I'm
hear this
excited.
one. So I have one contact who is kind of like a jack of a lot of trades.
Right.
Put it that way. So he gets called. This is I think like 3 years ago now. He gets called by a major league public company
Mhm.
about an inkling they had. And so what happened was they had just purchased or merged, however you want to say it, another recognizable major company to bring within their company. And essentially the executive board there, or the chief executives, were going to be brought on to be that
Right.
at the new conglomerate,
Right.
if you will, and be very high up
Right.
and be involved in both operations. So what the contact said to my guy is, you know, the CEO of this thing really rubs me the wrong way. I can't place my finger on it, but I think he's a Nazi. And that's exactly the reaction that my friend had. He goes, what the fuck you mean he's a Nazi? And they're like, well, he's German and he's from South America. And so my friend's like, all right, you know, there's a lot of Germans in
Exactly.
South America.
Yeah.
Yes, there are some that are Nazis, but what, like, is he wearing a swastika in his wallet? Like, what's going on? And they're like, no, he's like the nicest guy ever. Perfectly dressed, polite to everyone. He just rubs us the wrong way. Like there's something below there. So my friend says to him, listen, I'm a capitalist. Like, I'll take your money, but I'm going to tell you, please don't pay me. Like, this is a total waste of time. Like, I'm sure it's fine. He was looking at the company. He's like, he's running this amazing company. He looked at everyone else, like, on the board there. They're clearly not from South America and not Nazis. So he's like, there's no fucking way. And they keep bothering him about it, like, over and over. They're like, come on, please. And he's like, all right, fuck it. You know, all right, give me 50 grand, whatever, waste of your money. Let's go. Fucking guy was a Nazi.
Wow.
Card carrying, whole bit, like the shit that my guy uncovered of this was like, it was like the movie scene where you're like Indiana Jones, like, holy shit. And like they got him out of there, but it just goes to show you there was really, other than this person obviously having an incredible gut,
Yeah.
there was no evidence to show that this dude was that. Or it actually, I'll even take it a step farther because I don't know as much of the
Did
specifics.
he march always when he was walking around? You know, I mean, was that maybe the giveaway?
I don't know, but I don't even know if you would think there's something sinister to the fact that he was running this company, but I've never been able to put that together. Like, oh, what would he be doing? How would that, like, you know, help the cause of the Fourth Reich?
Right.
Maybe there's something. I'd have to ask my guy about that. But
You should have him on the show.
yeah, I don't think he would ever do it because
I
he's
see.
like the kind of dude whose entire life has been made on like people not knowing who he is.
Yeah, of course.
But
Yes, of course.
it's a great story, but also like kind of scary because it goes to show you like some of these people really are there. Is it like this rampant thing and like they are starting a Fourth Reich? I don't know about that, but you know, when you can get someone at that high a level to be in there totally inconspicuously,
Totally.
and then like they're that guy in this case like 2021. That's like this guy was probably like 50 years old. So
Wow.
this is like a third generation kind of dude,
Yeah.
meaning it's been passed down that much.
Yeah.
And here he is, like
You don't hear that.
maybe extending the cause.
Yeah, that's not. I mean, you rarely hear these stories, right, of continuation. But I do think, unfortunately, you know, that's why you have neo-Nazis. You know,
Yeah.
there's you know, many of them recognizable, some less so, some in the boardroom, and that's nuts. I mean, that is
nuts.
just subscribing to that is just, it's hard to wrap your head around it.
Why do you think ideologies like that never fully go away? They always kind of rise up. Not just neo-Nazis, any kind of like hate ideology.
Yeah. I think, people always want to believe in something that's can be easy, it's easy to subscribe to because it excludes certain people, or the ideas are kind of, it's easy. I mean, democracy is difficult, right? Democracy, you need a lot for democracy. Liberal democracy is not, unfortunately, is not the, history has shown us that, liberal democracy might be the blip in history, and autocracy and all kind of, more of the authoritarian ideologies are often the ones who win out because they're more homogeneous. They are less complex in a way. They are, it allows for a strong man or a strong woman, and people to rally around their ideas of one person or of one ideology, where the ideas are pretty, are quite, simple is it might not be the right word, but they're easy to understand. Democracy is hard. Democracy is difficult. It's a hard thing to execute. It's a hard thing. It's worth protecting, but it's difficult. The democratic process is very difficult. And more people seem to have a problem with it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, America. I always think about this in the context of the world. It's an infant. It's about to be 250 years old. That's
exactly.
Nothing. And like we're like this birthplace of like the democracy republic meeting each other to create the three chambers of government. Yeah. Three parts of government and everything.
Trias politica.
Yeah, it's a very cool thing, but you look around the world, I'll just use one anecdotal example right now. Like you look at the Middle East, we've talked about this on other podcasts before, including like with Andrew Bustamante. It's like, you have this collegiate culture where they are like historically across thousands of years, the culture itself gravitates towards a strongman leadership.
But Europe too.
Exactly. And Europe's like trying the democracy thing, but when you look at you took the words out of my mouth. When you look at their history, you go back, 100 years, it's the same thing as the collegiate culture, a different format, but same idea. Like people are like, oh, all right, let's go to this guy.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think it's also just human. I think that is also human nature.
Yeah.
Is it that is easier to get behind, It is simply easier. You don't have to think too much. Thinking is hard.
That's a good way to put it. You talked about earlier the denazification not necessarily working well, and a big part of that being like the United States political interests with the Cold War and fighting the Soviet Union. Have you ever read Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot?
I have not. No. Enlighten me.
You would like that.
Okay.
So he basically it's focused around Alan Dulles.
Oh, right, of course.
And the founding of CIA and everything. Yeah. And Alan Dulles is effectively, there were other people involved, but he's like the godfather of Operation Paperclip or whatever.
Yeah.
And so when I'm, just listening to you provide all the context today of these different German companies and everything, obviously like some of the whitewashing of history and the families, they certainly deserve their blame. But it's hard for me to not draw the conclusion that there is a hardcore enabling from the United States and like particularly our intelligence services, seeing as guys like Alan Dulles worked with Hitler and worked with some of these companies before the war. And then I think this is like the most fitting symbolism ever. He operated out of Switzerland during the war, right? Which is like the neutral place.
Exactly. It's where my grandmother was from and fled to, right? So she was, that was her way to get back into safety, my grandmother and aunt, to go back to her native Switzerland, right? Where my great-grandparents were. And because it was neutral and it was the most kind of opportunist country in terms of profiting from both
Right.
sides,
Right.
right? Getting
So-
the gold in,
Getting the what?
The gold, the Nazi
yes.
gold,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And all,
exactly.
and the banks keeping the Nazi checking accounts, yeah,
But point being, like, it's
and
fair
having
to
dollars as well, and then hosting dollars,
right.
Yeah.
So it's fair to say that there is certainly blame in the results of your investigation as far as like these places existing that exist within the power structures of the United
Yeah.
States.
Absolutely, and actually, my most recent investigation, which was published only in the October issue of Vanity Fair this year, is about what is currently Germany's wealthiest man, a man named Klaus Michael Kühne, who is 87 years old.
How do you spell that?
Kühne, Klaus Michael Kühne. It's if you do David Jong Vanity Fair, you'll have it up in no time.
Okay.
It's about a man who is 87 years old. He has a net worth of about 44 billion. He's the largest shareholder of Kuehne Nagel, which is the world's largest freight forwarding company. He's the largest shareholder of Lufthansa Group, the big airliner. He's the largest shareholder of Hapag-Lloyd, one of the largest shipping companies in the world. He's a large shareholder of Brenntag, which is the big chemical distributor. He just bought up Greyhound Buses, or the company that owns Greyhound Buses. He's 87. He doesn't have any kids. He doesn't have any heirs. He got married when he was 51 or 52 to his wife, who was also 50. His wife was 51. And his father and uncle profited greatly from the Third Reich by transporting the goods of families that had been deported to death camps and concentration camps, by their houses or all their goods being emptied out, and Kuehne Nagel and the Kuehne family or the Kuehne siblings transporting those goods to Germany, those looted goods to Germany, to be auctioned off, to be sold off at fire sale prices, to be given to families that whose houses had been bombed by the Allies, etc. And this happened of tens of thousands of families, mainly Jewish, in the Netherlands, in France, in Belgium, in Luxembourg. They greatly profited from it. They get denazified. And there's a letter in the denazification files that I found during my research, which says Alfred Kühne needs to be denazified as a matter of national security in the American occupation zone, blah, blah, blah. What turns out is that Kühne Nagel offices were used as cover firms by the CIA-backed West German intelligence operation. So there was they, and that's also in the article. I mean,
we will link this article in the description.
The Kuhnes went off scot-free from profiting directly from genocide, right? Because of their company's importance to American and British intelligence, because they served as a cover firm, because of a freight forwarding firm, right? They have companies all over the world, and they could have spies in there who have, freight forwarding firms is the most boring thing ever, right? So you have spies, nobody suspects you, but you have hundreds of offices around the world, and they could operate it, and it was, again, useful in the context of this fight against communism, that as a result they go off scot-free for their profiteering of genocide, because of their usefulness to Allied interests. And his son now, and that's the reason why I wrote the article, is that he actually shelved the commission study, because it mentions his father's and his uncle's and his company's activities during the Third Reich. So that's why the company, the story is called The Billionaire's Secret. And and if he dies, and since he doesn't have any heirs, he
He doesn't have heirs, or doesn't have heirs that we know of.
No, he doesn't have any heirs. Well, he doesn't have any heirs we know. But what is going to happen with his fortune, which is a low estimate, is 44 billion. But it's more close to 50 to 60 billion. Is it's going to his own family charity, right? And it's going to be one of the world's largest foundations. Yeah. So, and he is refusing. He's refusing to do any kind of reckoning, and it's curious to see once he dies, and he's 87, so it's probably not going to happen for too long from now. What the foundation board is going to do with the history of that fortune, right? So, I mean, this is one of the largest transportation fortunes in the world.
One of the things I struggle with all the time, and it's something that throughout this whole conversation is in the back of my mind whenever we talk about serious shit like this, where horrible things happen and maybe didn't get atoned for, or
right.
weren't, people ended up getting rewarded for it, as you've laid out today. But one of the things I always think about is like the trade-offs, and this is why I could never do these jobs. But it's like the world is a really fucked up place.
Yeah.
And bad shit happens all over the place. You've spent your career reporting and seeing a lot of it, and some of the stuff we'll talk about in a few minutes that you're seeing right now. And I do recognize that sometimes, and I don't mean this even in a sinister way, though sometimes it is, you will have dudes who got to make a decision sitting in an office based on, private intelligence of what's going on, where they see on one side somebody evil and on the other side somebody evil. Let's just keep it simple. And they do have to say the long-term ramifications of taking the side of the maybe lesser evil here, therefore letting this evil over here get a W in that way, is better. And there's something in our human nature, especially in mine and a lot of people listening right now, that just can't sit with the fact that this one over here gets off.
Yeah.
And I wonder how many situations today that you've been able to investigate, there actually were in those back rooms, an actual worse evil that they chose.
Yeah.
Well,
think about what the Dulles brothers did, for example, with Operation Ajax. I don't know if you've ever looked into it.
Operation Ajax,
which was the ousting of the democratically elected president of Iran in the early 1950s.
Oh yes, of course.
And putting the Shah in his place,
Yes.
which ends up basically setting the stage for the
Iranian
Islamic Revolution in 1979.
That's right.
So I mean, if you could say that, in a way, it might be too short-sighted to say, well, the Americans created the Dulles brothers created the Islamic regime, but it was active American intervention in a democratically elected process, which put the Shah in power, horrifically repressed his people. And 27 years later, Ayatollah Khamenei seizes power or chases the Shah away, or his troops did, and since then you have one of the most horrific regimes of the Middle East, one of the most repressive regimes of the Middle East.
And like sometimes, and I'm not a fan of the Dulles brothers, to be clear,
right?
But sometimes you'll look at like an example like that, and you may say hindsight 2020 on some things, like,
sure,
well, could they have really known 25 years later?
No, of course not. Of course not. No,
the carelessness sometimes of who you may
hubris,
put in there.
The hubris, the arrogance, or like the, I mean, it's really playing God. It's playing God.
Yes.
It is actually playing God. Yeah.
Look at Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Look at who we put in there.
Yeah.
And that only took that full context was 20 years.
Yeah.
And there were guys who knew in 2011 exactly how that was going to go.
Yeah.
Like within 10 years, they're like, oh, yep, this is how it's going to end. And they called it back then. And that's what it did.
Yeah.
I mean, it's messy, man. It's fucking, I'm not envious of the people who have to be in those rooms.
Sure.
And sometimes it's the wrong people in those rooms, of course.
Yeah, we'll make them very insidious decisions.
Yes.
And
Yes. Now, you've mentioned this like throughout some of the conversation today, but as far as looted wealth, because the transfer of wealth that happened with the Nazis illegally taking wealth from people that they were enslaving was like the biggest in human history. Have you uncovered some of that being literally assets under management, if you will, being tied back to some of these families?
I mean, it's pretty much impossible to to go back or to say now, well, this amount of euros or dollars was part of that. What I can say is, I mean, the larger decision by the Allied occupation authorities, by the Americans, to let them, to make the, again, political expedient decision to let them keep their assets following denazification, that just provided the fertile groundwork for the resurgence of Germany and allowed them to just keep their fortunes to begin with. What they had robbed, what they had taken, what they had, procured during the war, on the backs of millions of forced and slave laborers, taking people's lives and livelihood. That one can say, by and large. Now, of course, when it comes to the matter of art, for example, right? I mean, if you look at the restitution cases that are still going on, it's about art, and it's about real estate mostly.
Do you have some good examples?
Well,
right now?
For example, the Kuhne guy who I wrote about, like Kuhne Nagel, one of the things they did in addition to transporting, the looted empty contents of people's houses who had been murdered and deported, they would also transfer looted art, very valuable looted art, and would sometimes even lose it.
Yes.
This is very famous telegram that I found in a report by the OSS, a predecessor to the CIA, of Kuhne Nagel losing 16 paintings, like 5 by Picasso, by Cézanne, by all the big impressionists, and these paintings never resurfacing again. So what happened to these paintings, right? They're still, in terms of actual concrete hidden wealth, people are finding, investigators are finding still caches, particularly of art, or people are coming forward who have, where the provenance of piece of art are not clear, 80 years onwards.
Right.
And that, of course, constitutes, this art constitutes, major, we're talking about billions, if not tens of billions of
course.
hidden wealth. Yeah.
There's also that period immediately at the end of World War II that I personally think is one of the most underreported periods in journalistic history, where you have the three allies, Britain, U.S., and the USSR, all descending from different angles deep into Germany.
Yeah.
And it was a massive, basically like treasure hunt race, who could uncover the most shit and probably never tell anyone about
it. And bring it back to a museum in St. Petersburg or Moscow or an archive.
And no one knows nothing.
in DC or you name it. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's, because most of these, going back to my research, right? I mean, I dug a lot into German archives where, of course, it was mostly focused on these families. But for the broader picture, so much of it was also in American archives, where the Allied occupation authorities just took everything back, took documents back to the U.S. and like all caches of reams of documents at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., where, I got to discover so much, and there is still so much left to be uncovered. I mean, this is going to be a period of time where, in 20 years, there will still be major revelations. No doubt about that.
I agree, and I think there's many things that are lost to history forever.
Yes,
and I think
unfortunately,
it's a way larger percentage than
you're right.
most people realize.
Totally, it's true. It's a good point.
But it's amazing reporting, man. And we're gonna have your book linked in the description for people to check out. But you're a jack of a few different trades here. You're also you've now been in the Middle East for 3 years, and if I understand correctly, you're living in Tel Aviv.
Yeah, that is correct. Yes.
What ended up getting you there?
Yeah. So when I was in Germany, so I actually ended up. My former partner is German, and we moved to Tel Aviv together because she became a TV correspondent for German TV,
In Tel Aviv.
And in Tel Aviv.
They let that
Yeah, as a
happen?
correspondent. Yeah. Well, the Germans, they want to make it right. Yeah. And I started writing as a Middle East correspondent for a Dutch newspaper. So yeah, so we moved out there, and I started covering the entirety of the Middle East. So, World Cup soccer in Qatar, presidential elections in Turkey, economic crisis in Lebanon.
Oh, everything.
Yeah, everything. Yeah. Because I didn't have, I think I found the narratives in the larger Middle East to be more interesting than focusing at that time, on Israel or West Bank or Gaza, or
Pre-October
2021,
7th.
pre-October 7th. Now, I ended up being, I was in Tel Aviv on October 7th, and I ended up being the first Dutch correspondent to be in the kibbutzes, and I'd never seen dead people, or never seen, seeing Hamas, dead bodies in ditches, or being in these kibbutzim where you.
Wait, you
would
were
spend-
there?
Yeah, I was there. Yeah, 3 days after 72 hours after the attack began. Yeah, I've never been in a war zone before. I mean, on October 7th, I transformed from a regional financial correspondent or regional business correspondent to a local war correspondent.
Oh, wait. So okay. So the first couple years when you were covering things across the Middle East, it was all financial, Ben.
Yeah, because I was working for the Dutch Financial Daily. I was working for a
okay.
Dutch financial newspaper. I mean, I'm
Sorry,
trained
I
as a
missed that.
financial. No, sorry, I didn't explain it well. I was working I am still working for a Dutch financial newspaper as their Middle East correspondent. But of course, the focus became on the place where I happened to be based. I mean, I could have been based in Beirut or Istanbul or Cairo or Dubai. Yeah, but I was based in Tel Aviv. So,
So now the bulk of your reporting, I would imagine,
Yes.
since then has obviously been on that particular crisis.
Totally.
And you're
Totally.
there. So
Yes.
first of all, you're living in Tel Aviv. There's got to be like all kinds of like constant rocket alerts and stuff coming in, right? What's that like?
Near daily. Yeah, no, I mean, in the beginning, it's scary. But you get, unfortunately, prior to October 7th, I had never heard a rocket alarm go off. So in the 2 years that I'd lived there prior to October 7th, I never heard a rocket alarm. And I remember waking up the morning of October 7th at about 6:30 a.m. local time, and getting woken up by the rocket sirens. And it became immediately clear from the footage that was filtering in that that one didn't understand the size of the attack, but one did understand there was going to be a war. I remember texting my boss or sending my boss a WhatsApp message saying, this is going to be war. There's rockets over. There's armed men in the streets of various, Israeli streets. There's dead bodies everywhere. This is going to be war.
And
That
they
became
were there.
abundantly clear.
They were there for hours, right? So
They were there for days.
Yeah, well,
They were for days, yes. Yeah, I mean, they found, I think, according to Israeli army estimates, 3,800 Hamas fighters crossed the border that day, and I think about 2,200 civilians. And I even found
2,200 civilians.
Yes, yeah. Because the unprotected, or the the wall came. The fence was broken down, and people could get through. And what people tend to forget now, but there were a lot of protests at that border in the days running up to in the weeks running up to the attack, which was more a local reporting thing. But so a lot of civilians got through too. And I think even months later they found two, whether it was civilians or Hamasniks is unclear, but they still found two people somewhere holed up in a Bedouin village somewhere. Yeah.
For the rest of my life, I'll never forget that day because it was a very weird lineup of the universe. But there's this guy, Mark Turner, who I had been talking with for months to come on and do a podcast. Right. And he is a Scottish, Jewish, U.S. former recon Marine. So quite
Wow.
the combo there.
Wow.
And I think he did like 11 years in the military,
Wow.
and then started a foundation called the Overwatch Foundation,
Mm-hmm.
where he goes around the world to various war zones and trains, the resistance or whatever.
Yeah.
And this kind of started with the whole Ukraine thing. He
Right.
was there like on the ground in
Right.
Ukraine like a day in
Yeah.
because one of his buddies in the US was Ukrainian and
Right.
had to go back, yada, yada, yada. So we had set up this podcast where, he was going to come in and talk all about his experience in Ukraine, which was very nuanced because he was like, this
Right.
war is really fucked up. Like, we got to stop this, but here's what's happening. And when we were talking about this, he was telling me how he was currently training IDF soldiers on the Gaza border.
Oh, wow.
So
Wow.
I book him a flight, maybe beginning of September. I book him a flight from Chicago. He's going to be back in the U.S. for a week. So I book him a flight for Saturday, October 7th
wow.
at 7 a.m.
Oh, wow.
And he lands here at 9 a.m. or whatever. And this is when it's all breaking out and everything.
No, that's 2 a.m. Israel time, right? So 9 a.m.
Well, Israel's ahead. So
Israel
would
7.
be-
Oh, you're
Israel
totally
would-
right.
Yeah,
What
Israel
am I
would be
saying?
like
It's
2
completely
p.m.,
the reverse.
something like that.
Pardon me. My math is off. You're absolutely right. People here, because I have a friend here who got married, who's American Israeli, and who got married here on October 7th in New York. And they live in Tel Aviv. He lives with his Argentinian American wife in Tel Aviv, and they got married in October. They went through with the wedding, but they woke up, and one of his cousins was also
Crazy.
killed on October 7th, and they woke up to the news. So you're absolutely right. Pardon me.
Yeah. So I, he's working with these guys. So he's in here like, Alessio remembers it, like in between. Like when we were taking bathroom breaks, he's like going through the WhatsApp and we're hearing like the audio, like on the ground, like getting some video of it and shit. I mean, it was a crazy time. But point being, a lot's happened since then.
Yes,
and
a lot has happened since then.
This is like the most nuanced crisis in the world as far as like that long-term disagreement over the land and everything. This is old as time.
Yes, that's
but
right.
like. You get to see within 72 hours up close the destruction of that event, which there's no doubt it was horrific on every level. In the year plus of 15 months since then, like what do you think of where this at's right now? Where this is at as a war?
So just before we came in, right, there was a ceasefire announced with Lebanon, Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, is putting forward a ceasefire proposal between Hezbollah and or bringing it to his security cabinet for approval. I think it's a 30-day ceasefire. There doesn't seem to be an end to the war in Gaza. It doesn't seem like Netanyahu is going to stop the war in Gaza, which his own generals and his Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, who we just fired, has said, we have achieved all our military objectives in Gaza.
Yeah.
It is unclear what we are doing there. We're losing soldiers, forget about, how the rest of the world is responding to this, but just from their perspective, right? And to many, it seems that Netanyahu still has 3 corruption cases simmering against him on the background. His intent to stay in power, no matter what. There's, he said he would establish a National Committee of Inquiry regarding the security failures of October 7th, right? None of that has happened.
Yeah.
Because he says, well, the war is still ongoing. Can't have a commission of inquiry. So for him personally, staying in power is incredibly beneficial. Continuing the war is very beneficial to him staying in power. Now, of course, Israel is so dependent on American military aid.
Yes.
And with a new administration coming in January 20th, 2025, and also the unpredictability of the incoming or the return of the next commander in chief, who knows what that might happen? You know, who knows?
He likes Israel though.
He does,
He
but
likes
you
Netanyahu.
know, but he had a big falling out with Netanyahu, and Netanyahu thanked Biden or congratulated Biden.
But they're good now. They're good now.
Okay,
according to reports.
Well, yeah, I think he already visited him and already spoke 3 times. I think since his re-election. But you know, maybe listen. You know, the Abraham Accords did happen in his previous administration, right? It could mean a global it could mean a regional shift. You know, I'm a half a glass half full kind of guy. You know, I look at things intrinsically positive, and
I like that.
And it could mean good things, but if I look at his incoming cabinet appointees with regards to who's going, Mike Huckabee becoming the ambassador to Israel, for example, the American ambassador to Israel,
who doesn't believe Palestine exists.
Exactly. For example, or who doesn't even refers to the West Bank as the West Bank, but calls it Judea and Samaria. You know, it is hard with those men in power, I think, to reach anything on a 2-state solution. Now, what that means with regards to Iran policy, what it means vis-a-vis Hezbollah, you know, and what it means for the normalizations of relations between Israel and the Saudis, which I think both sides are still very keen on. And I could see the new administration making headway on that, even though the Saudis have said there needs to be a Palestinian state first, but we'll see whether MBS will actually hold to that or give way. You know,
he owes Trump a chip for Khashoggi too. That's the other problem. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, owes him a chip in the sense that because
Trump helped him get off that.
Yeah.
Fuck
yeah. Yes. Correct. Yes. So, you know, and they you know, they have rapport, you know, MBS and Trump. That much is clear, and Trump's son-in-law too, who's not going to be part of the new administration, but with his new private equity venture has received $2 billion from the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund and other Gulf wealth funds, sovereign wealth funds. So, you know, I think the major concern is regarding Bibi's lack of taking responsibility for the security the security lapses that led to October 7th, and just thinking all about, you know, about the fate of the 101 hostages that are still being held, the civilian situation in the Gaza Strip. I got to, you know, foreign journalists in general are still not allowed to enter the Gaza Strip independently. You're either go embedded with the Israeli army. I joined a Dutch military aid mission for a food drop above Gaza after in April this year, and to see the destruction with my own eyes.
Wait, so you were flying?
Yes. Yeah, I was in Gaza airspace for 4 minutes. That's as close as
you're allowed to go.
That's as close as I was allowed to go. You can go with an Israeli. You can go embedded with the Israeli army, but then you know you're not getting shown the full picture. No. So you know, the Dutch don't have any skin in the game. So, you know, I could do that. I could see the destruction, and you know, you get a good view because we're pretty close to the ground. And for 4 minutes, you know, seeing the leveling of northern Gaza, of Gaza City, which is the largest city within the Strip. You know, back in April, and you know, we're 8 months later. And the situation has, shall we say, you know, has regressed even further. So, you know, it seems that Netanyahu, with the ceasefire that's being announced today, is giving kind of a chip, saying, "Hey, you know, we've made peace now with Hezbollah. You will see if it lasts, or we've made a ceasefire with Hezbollah, but I want to continue the war in Gaza without any military, again, without, with the military leaders saying our objectives have been achieved. But of course, the objective of the release of the hostages has not been achieved. But that is, that objective has to be released through negotiations, which are also ongoing. Many think that there needs to be we've been talking this whole episode about taking responsibility, right? And many people feel that Netanyahu needs to take responsibility for what has led to the occurrence of October 7th and the security lapse in the first place.
Yes.
And that responsibility is not yet happening, and it comes at the detriment of literally of millions of people.
Yes.
And it is.
And you saw that up close or as close as you could get from the sky.
I saw that as and I speak to many Gazans, those that are as part of my reporting. I keep in touch with many of the hostage families, with the Gazans that are, still in the Gaza Strip, that is outside of Gaza. I go to the West Bank a lot, and I mean it is or to the border with Lebanon. And it is, it is a very bleak situation, and with no signs of improving. And there's also seems to be, recently my home city of Amsterdam, was kind of the scene for I'm a huge soccer fan. I'm a huge Ajax Amsterdam fan, and I was super excited watching the Ajax Tel Aviv game in a bar in Tel Aviv. And then being called up saying, oh, Netanyahu is sending 2 planes, which he retracted, and also complete lack of nuance.
Yes.
In that discussion, American president, this is a pogrom, at one hand, the other side saying, only hooligans got beat up. That is just not true. The people who got beat up were like grandfathers with their grandchildren who just wanted to go to a game, and the complete lack of nuance and the hatred. I found it to be so weird having reported on this conflict now for 15 months full time, that my own home city, suddenly the conflict is exported, and the same kind of narratives, competing propaganda narratives that are, each side are benefiting, or trying to leverage or for their own benefit. I found it to be really just maddening and perverse and really really self-serving. And I found, I've been super busy with reporting on that, and also the events that what actually happened, rather than everybody rushing to judgment and judging things on video imagery and people were beat up in the most horrific way. It is still unclear what started. It's clear that there was no premeditation days in advance. But it is also clear that there were, that innocents got beat up, and it was very strange to seeing it suddenly play out in the streets of my hometown.
I can imagine.
And
also when you're so informed, by the way.
Yeah, but that's
there.
Tough because there's a lot of, I found it as well. So many. In my personal surroundings, so many kind of social media warriors who just have never been to the region. I've never been to the Middle East. I've never been to Israel. I've never been to Gaza. I've never been to the West Bank. I've never been to Lebanon. I've never been to Jordan, right, or to Turkey, you name it, or the Gulf. And they just rush to judgment, and they dehumanize the other.
Yes.
There is, it is so important, and that is what lacks it, is seeing the other and seeing the other's pain, and the refusal to see that, and is and the hatred that is feared upon one another. I mean, it is really, it breaks my heart as a human being who is, as a professional, I don't have any skin in the game in the I'm there, had it not been for my ex, I would have never moved to the region, right? I'm doing the best I can with my abilities, but there is no, it is, incredibly frustrating, and which is also a fact of war. I learned, this is the first conflict that I've been covering, is that, war is just also propaganda is as important in war as anything else.
Yeah, it's amazing that in in the world now where everyone has this to hold up and suddenly take a video, it has made propaganda 10 times worse, because the context of what the screen shows here and doesn't show here and here for any side of any of these conflicts we see is insane. And you are such a fascinating guy to be covering it, because you got baptism by fire, if you will, on October 7th.
By fire.
Right?
There was a total baptism by fire, literally.
And you have now seen the worst of at least of what we know, of the destruction of both sides of this.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate the nuance with which you talk about it, because I get yelled at all the time by people for speaking nuanced on this issue. I see good and evil on both sides simultaneously. Yeah. I also see, let's say, like the hostage of the moment as well. No pun intended there.
Right.
What I would mean by that is, like, for example, I would say anecdotally, Israel's current government is not the greatest government, and I have a lot of issues with that. That doesn't mean that the people of Israel are their government, and that extends to them. I think Netanyahu, like, it's kind of odd to me, the year leading up to October 7th.
Right.
I could have obviously never predicted this, but I studied the shit out of Israel and Netanyahu in particularly. And I had just finished, I read a biography that was like kind of an anti-Netanyahu biography.
Answer Pfeffer's biography.
Yes, I think that was it.
He's a great reporter.
And then I read Netanyahu's own words. And I had finished his book about 2 weeks before October 7th. And, let's just go off of what he said himself. This is a guy who has strong beliefs. Okay, that's fine. You can do that. But his personal history with Gaza itself goes way back. He literally resigned as finance minister because that deal was going through where they were giving Gaza away.
Right.
And I understand that, like, Israel's kind of stuck between a shit and a fart when they did that, because they have a lot of people in there who don't like them, and they share two borders with them and a sea border with them, and then the south is the Sinai.
Right.
And it's like, I always say to people, I'm like, if in 2006 Iraq were where Mexico is, we'd probably close our border too. So it's a tough spot to be, but you also create a 20-mile zone of people who have no economic opportunity and are going to turn towards whatever, says some glimmer of hope there, who may also say, by the way, down with Israel or whatever. And this is how you get what you get. So it's this self-fulfilling prophecy that keeps happening. And it does, unfortunately, make me cynical about ever seeing some sort of peace in that region, because it's just this giant circle over and over.
There's, the leaders in power are not making decisions in the best interest of the people that they're governing, or in the case of Hamas also, holding hostage. Now Gaza in such ruins that you can't really speak of a working regime anymore, by and large. But Hamas is very much still there. Islamic Jihad is very much still there. Other, militant factions are still there, but it's become more of kind of a roving band of gangsters. But it is abundantly clear that it is a retaining of power rather than the people's benefit, the people's interest that is being prioritized.
Yes.
So decisions are being made that are in the self-interest of survivals of leaders, and not in the interests of the people that are being governed.
Agreed.
And that is, it does make one extremely cynical. I mean, it is not. you know, it's not my position to share that cynicism, but it is hard not to get, you know, it's hard not to get downcast or jaded from the events that one sees transpire in front of them, and the radicalization on all sides and the hardening of senses on all sides. And who knows? Hopefully, you know, the next few years are going to provide a thaw in that. I you know, again, you know, I see there's always, you know, I've been watching Say Nothing, this book, this series based on a book by Patrick Radden Keefe on the travels in Northern Ireland.
Radden Keefe.
Yeah,
I don't know about this though.
yeah, it just came out on FX or on Hulu.
Okay.
And it's a 9-part series, and you know, it's about the troubles in Northern Ireland and the, you know, the IRA versus the British Army, and you know, I mean, this is also this is a conflict that was resolved eventually, right? And nobody ever thought it would be resolved, but it was also leaders making hard and also making decisions in their own interest, but to extend the hand to the other side.
Yes.
Which a lot of people didn't agree with, but they push it through and look at you know, look at Northern Ireland now and look at Ireland now.
That's
Ireland
right.
is absolutely thriving. You know, it's one of the best performing economies in Europe, globally. In the end, England shot itself in the foot with Brexit, but that's a different story. You know, but which did lead to, again, the return of a bit of sectarian tensions. But you know, who knows? You know, I think there's so many actors in the Middle East who don't have the best interest at hand, and we're just interested in retaining power and repressing their own people or gaslighting their own people in order to retain power. But you know, the only thing you know, I can do is bring a nuanced view and try to tell the stories on all sides to the best of my abilities, you know, to the public, and hope and pray for better days. I mean, that is literally it, you know. And a ceasefire is hopefully a step, or a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah is hopefully a step in the right direction, and not, you know, another cynical play that comes to the detriment of whomever, whether it's the hostages or the Palestinians or the Israelis or the Lebanese.
Gut feel, do we get a ceasefire in Gaza in the next year?
Ooh, in the next year, I think so. I think even sooner. I think we could see a ceasefire, or at least a initial new hostage exchange, a hostage release for a hostage release with then, you know, Palestinian prisoners being exchanged in return for you know, for as an opening, as a start, right? It's exactly a year ago since the last hostages were released by negotiations, right? I mean, there was a rescue mission a few months ago. Right. They released 4, and you know, there has to be a ceasefire in Gaza, because else, you know, it will mean that tens of thousands of more people will die with if that doesn't happen. So I would see. I can say, you know, we're late November now. We're closing in on Thanksgiving. I could say within 3 months there will be a ceasefire in Gaza.
I hope you're right.
Yes,
I think that'd be.
Yeah,
I think that'd be
absolutely.
amazing if
Yes.
we could get that. It's a good first step.
yeah, absolutely.
David,
And the release of the hostages. Yeah.
David, your work's amazing, man. This was fucking awesome. The information you got and the research you did on your book is incredible, and obviously your reporting now in the Middle East is really important and good stuff. And I appreciate all the thoughts there. So I really enjoyed this, man. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you. Thank you for the fantastic, informed, and deep conversation, Julian. I really appreciate that.
Of course,
Thank you for your work.
We're definitely gonna have to do this again in the
Yes.
future. All
Deal.
right? So link to the book down in description. Nazi Billionaires. It's like the greatest title of all time. You got to buy it. So thank you, David, and everybody else. You know what it is. Give it a thought. Get back to me. Peace. Thank you guys for watching the episode. Before you leave, please be sure to hit that subscribe button and smash that like button on the video. It's a huge help. And also, if you're over on Instagram, be sure to follow the show at Julian Dorey Podcast, or also on my personal page at Julian D. Dorey. Both links are in the description below. Finally, if you'd like to catch up on our latest episodes, use the Julian Dorey Podcast playlist link in the description below. Thank you.